Welcome to the React full course. In this course, we'll learn how to build complex websites with React. And by the end of this course, we'll build two projects, a chatbot and an e-commerce project. We'll start from the very basics of React, like how to set up React with JavaScript. And we'll learn each feature in detail, step by step. We'll learn the major features of React, as well as advanced features, like how to use React with a backend, deploy React to the internet with AWS, React with TypeScript, and React with AI. You can find the sections of this course below the video here and here. You can also change the speed of the video here. And you can find subtitles for different languages here. And after each lesson, I'll give you a bunch of exercises that you can do on your own to practice the skills that we learned. In total, this course has over 125 exercises. So with that being said, let's get started. I'm going to be doing this course on Windows, but the steps are the same if you're using a Mac. Before we begin, we're going to need two pieces of software. Number one is a web browser, and number two is a code editor. The most popular web browser for web development is Google Chrome, and the most popular code editor for web development is VS Code. So I recommend using these. If you need to install these, you can search for them on Google, click the link, and follow the instructions to download and install. Now, you'll also need to know the basics of JavaScript. React is built on JavaScript, and we're going to be writing a lot of JavaScript when using React. Don't worry, you don't need to be an expert in JavaScript. You just need to know some basic features, like the ones listed here. And I'll also try to review JavaScript features as we go through this course. If you want to learn JavaScript in more detail, you can check out my JavaScript full course in the video description. Finally, you'll need to know the basics of HTML. When using React, we're going to be writing a lot of HTML. Again, don't worry, you don't need to be an expert in HTML. You just need to know some basic features, like the ones listed here. And I'll try my best to review HTML features as we go through this course. If you want to learn HTML in more detail, you can check out my HTML and CSS full course in the video description. If you have any issues in this course, you can check the troubleshooting guide in the description. Now that we have all the requirements that we need, we're ready to learn React. On our computer, we're going to go to our desktop, and we're going to create a new folder. So here, I'm going to right-click and create a new folder. And this folder is going to contain all the code that we write in this course. So let's name it React-Course and press Enter. Next, we're going to open this folder in our code editor, VS Code. So we'll open VS Code and then click File, Open Folder, and select the folder we just created. So I created my folder on the desktop, and it's this folder right here. So we'll select this folder, and then click Select Folder. And we can close this welcome page. So now, let's create a new file to learn React. So up here, we're going to create a new file, and we're going to name it react-basics.html, and press Enter. As a review, a file that ends in .html contains HTML code, and this creates a website. Next, we're going to create a website, and we're going to set up React on this website. Now, to save time, we're actually going to download some starting code. So we're going to open our web browser, Google Chrome. And at the top, we're going to type supersimple.dev/react-basics and press enter. So this page has some starting HTML code we can use to learn React. So now let's click on this page, and we're going to select all this code by pressing Ctrl-A on Windows or Command-A on Mac. And we're going to copy paste this code into our file. So we'll right-click, copy. We can also press Ctrl-C on Windows or Command-C on Mac. And then open our code editor. And then inside this HTML file, we're going to right-click and paste. We can also press Ctrl-V on Windows or Command-V on Mac. And finally, let's save this file by pressing Ctrl-S on Windows or Command-S on Mac. Next, we're going to open this file in our web browser to see what the website looks like. To make this easier, we're going to use a VS Code extension called Live Server. So the benefit of Live Server is it will automatically refresh the web page whenever we change some code. So it's going to make our coding easier. If you don't have Live Server installed, you can click the extension section and then search for Live Server at the top. And then click Install. Once Live Server is installed, we're going to go back to our code, and we're going to open this file in Live Server by right-clicking in the file and click Open with Live Server. So Live Server will open the HTML file using our browser, and it's going to create a website. And we should see the message, "Welcome to Super Simple Dev React course" on this website. So this message is displayed by React, and this means that we successfully set up React on this website. Now let's go back to VS Code. And this is the minimum amount of code that we need to set up React. We're going to go through this code step by step to make sure that you understand everything here. First of all, what is React? React is an external library that helps us create websites easier. Now, there are two parts to this statement. Number one, React is an external library. And number two, React helps us create websites easier. Let's go through these one by one. So number one, React is an external library. First, let's review what an external library is. So here, we have a bunch of HTML code. And HTML code creates a website. And now, how do we load JavaScript onto our website? There are several ways to load JavaScript on a website. One way is to use an HTML element called a script element. For example, under this div element, let's create a script element using less than script greater than and less than slash script greater than, but our code editor might autocomplete this for us. Now, inside this script element, we can write some JavaScript code. For example, console.log the string hello. As a review, this code displays the text hello in the console. So now let's save, and we're going to open the console in our browser. So we'll open Google Chrome, and Live Server is going to automatically refresh the page and run that JavaScript code. And now we're going to check the console by right-clicking and then click Inspect and open the console tab. And you'll see that inside the console, we displayed the text hello. And that's exactly what this code does. So we successfully loaded this code onto our website. We'll go back to VS Code. So this is one way to run JavaScript code on a website. First, we create a script element, and then we put our JavaScript code inside. Another way to run JavaScript is to save our JavaScript code in a file. So on the left, let's create a new file, and we'll name it react-basics.js and press enter. So when we end a file with .js, this file contains JavaScript code. So now let's move that code into this file. So we'll go to our HTML file. We're going to select this code and then right-click, cut. We can also press Ctrl X on Windows or Command X on Mac. And inside our JavaScript file, we're going to right-click and paste. And save this file. Now, to run the code inside this file, we're going to go back to our HTML, and we're going to add an HTML attribute to this script element. So after this script, we're going to type space, and then type src equals double quotes. So the src attribute lets us load JavaScript from a file. Inside these double quotes, we're going to tell the computer which JavaScript file to load. So we'll type react-basics.js. So this will look for a file called react-basics.js beside the current HTML file. So it's going to find the file here, and it's going to run all the code inside this file. So now let's save and open our browser and check the result. Live Server will automatically refresh the page, and inside the console, you can see that we display the message, hello. So we're successfully loading code from inside a file. We'll go back to VS Code, and this is a second way to load JavaScript. We save our JavaScript in a file, and then we load it from the file. Next, the script element can actually load code from anywhere on the internet, not just on our computer. For example, we're going to open Google Chrome, and then we're going to create a new tab. And at the top, we're going to type unpkg.com/supersimpledev/external-library.js and press enter. So on this website, we have some JavaScript code. So this is just normal JavaScript code. It displays a message, this is an external library inside the console. So using the script element, we can actually take this code from this website and run it on our own website. To do that, we're going to open VS Code, and inside the src attribute, instead of loading the JavaScript code from a file, we're going to load the JavaScript code from a website. So first, we need the URL of the website. So we'll go back to Google Chrome, and at the top, this is the URL. And we're going to copy, and inside VS Code, we're going to remove this file, and we're going to paste the URL. And now let's save. So now let's go back to our website, and we're going to go to the tab for our website, and we're going to check the console. And inside the console, you can see we displayed the message, this is an external library. So we successfully loaded JavaScript code from another website. Let's go back to VS Code. So using the script element, we can load JavaScript code from anywhere on the internet. So this code is called an external library. An external library is just code that is outside of our computer. It's code that someone else wrote, and we can load that code into our website using the script element. Now, React is an external library. So React is just a bunch of code that is outside our computer that someone else wrote, and we can load this code on our website and use it. So inside our starting file, at the bottom here, these two script elements load the React external library. So it loads react.js and react-dom.js. So let's open these URLs in our browser and take a look. So we're going to select this URL, and we're going to copy. And inside Google Chrome, we're going to create a new tab. And at the top, we're going to paste the URL and press enter. And on this website, you can see that we have a bunch of JavaScript code. So this is the code for React. We're just taking all of this code and then loading it onto our website. Let's go back to VS Code. And the same thing applies to this second URL. If we select it and then copy, and in our browser, create a new tab, and then at the top, paste, and press enter, you can see that this website also has a bunch of JavaScript code. And this is also the code for React. So as you can see, React is an external library. It's just a bunch of code that is outside of our computer that someone else wrote. And we can load this code on our website and use it. Now, before we move on, there's two things you might be wondering about. Number one, why are we loading React from Super Simple Dev instead of some official React URL? So this just lets me control the version of React. If we loaded React from the official URL, you might get a different version of React than the one I'm using in this video, which might cause issues. So for the video, we're going to use a Super Simple Dev URL to make sure that we have the same version of React and you're able to follow along. The second thing you might be wondering is, why are there two external libraries for React, React and React DOM? So React is designed to be used in different places, like websites and also mobile apps. So the creators of React decided to divide it into two external libraries. React, which contains all the shared features that are used in both websites and mobile apps, and React DOM, which contains features that are specific to websites. So if we're using React to create websites, we need to load the React external library and the React DOM external library. If we were using React to create mobile apps, we would load the React external library and a different library called React Native. In this course, we're going to use React to create websites. So we're going to load React and React DOM. Okay, so we learned that React is an external library. It's just a bunch of code that is outside of our computer, and we're going to load it onto our website. The next part is React helps us create websites easier. So now let's learn how to use React. We'll go back to VS Code, and we're going to scroll down, and these two lines of JavaScript at the bottom sets up React. So let's go through this step by step. In the first line, we're using document.querySelector to get an HTML element from the website and put it into our JavaScript. As a review, this is a feature of JavaScript called the DOM, or the Document Object Model. Basically, JavaScript gives us this document object, which sort of combines JavaScript and HTML together. It lets us get HTML elements from the page and put them into our JavaScript, and it also lets our JavaScript modify HTML elements on the page. So the DOM, or the document object, sort of combines HTML and JavaScript together, and it lets the two languages interact with each other. Don't worry, you don't need to know a lot about the DOM to learn React. I'm just explaining what this code does, so you understand what's going on here. So the code document.querySelector lets us get an HTML element from the page and put it into our JavaScript. Inside these brackets, we tell the computer which HTML element we want to get from the page. So if we start with a dot, this means we're going to look for a class. And here we're looking for the class JS-container. Up here, this div element has the class JS-container, so it's going to take this element and put it into our JavaScript. And finally, we're going to save it inside a variable so we can use it later. Next, let's go to the second line of code, and React DOM.createRoute basically sets up React. To set up React, we have to give it an HTML element. So we're going to give it the element that we saved up here, which is this div element. So basically the way this works is that this element is going to act as a container. Everything that we create with React is going to be displayed inside this element or inside this container. The reason React uses a container is because it keeps things organized. Everything inside this element will be controlled by React, and React will not affect anything outside of this element. So it keeps things isolated and organized. So after we set up React with a container, we can start using the features of React. One feature of React is .render. Render means to display something. So .render lets us display something inside this container or inside this element. Now, between the brackets of render, we're going to tell React what to display inside the container. So right now, we told it to display the text, "Welcome to Super Simple Dev React course." And if we go back to our website and open the tab for our website, and after we open the console, this time we're going to go to the Elements tab. So this lets us see the HTML that's currently on the page. We're going to open this body element, and inside we can see our container. And you can see that React rendered or displayed the message, "Welcome to Super Simple Dev React course," inside our container. So we'll go back to our code. And that's how we set up and use React. First, we give it a container, and then we can display things like a message inside this container. Before we continue, let's review the rest of the code in this file to make sure that we understand every line of code. So the HTML at the top here, as well as the bottom here, this HTML is called the HTML structure. As a review, this is a standard structure that we follow when writing HTML. At the top, doctype HTML tells a computer to use a modern version of HTML. The HTML element represents a website, so all the code for our website should go inside the HTML element. Now, every website is split into two sections, the head section and the body section. The head section generally contains things that are not visible on the page. For example, the title element sets the text at the top of the tab. So this is not visible on the page. So we put this inside the head. The body section generally contains things that are visible on the page. For example, the div element will be visible on the page, so we put it inside the body. Finally, we usually put our script elements at the bottom of the body because we want our HTML to be created first, and then our JavaScript can modify the HTML. So that's a review of the HTML structure. This is a standard structure that we follow when writing HTML. So now we understand almost every line of code in this file. This is just the HTML structure that we have to follow. This is a container that we give to React to keep things isolated and organized. This is an example of an external library, and this loads the React external library, or loads the code for React. And this sets up and uses React. The last two lines that we haven't learned yet are these two lines right here. So here, we're loading another external library, and this external library is called Babel. So again, if I open this URL in my browser, copy, and in my browser, I'm going to create a new tab, and at the top, paste, and press enter, you'll see that this website contains a bunch of JavaScript code. And this is the code for another external library called Babel. So we'll go back to VS Code and let's learn what is the Babel external library. Babel is known as a JavaScript compiler. So it basically translates other languages into JavaScript. So why do we need Babel? When using React, we actually don't use normal JavaScript. We use an enhanced version of JavaScript called JSX. JSX stands for JavaScript XML. It's the same as JavaScript, but we can also write HTML directly in our JavaScript code. So it's just JavaScript with extra features. So let's do an example of JSX to learn how to use it. Inside the script element at the bottom, we're going to create a new variable using const, and let's call it button, equals, and now let's create a button HTML element. So here, we're going to type HTML directly, less than, button, greater than, and then less than / button, greater than. So this is actually HTML code, and we're writing it directly inside our JavaScript. So this HTML code creates a button, and then inside our button, we can put the text hello. So this code here is actually using JSX. So JSX works the same way as JavaScript, except we can also write HTML directly in our JavaScript code. So what does this code do? It's actually pretty straightforward. This code creates a new button element inside our JavaScript, and then we save it in a variable. We can actually do this with normal JavaScript as well. We can use the DOM, and we can create a button element in our JavaScript like this. So you can think of this JSX code as a shortcut for this JavaScript code. So that's JSX. JSX is an enhanced version of JavaScript. So it's the same as JavaScript, but we can also write HTML directly in our JavaScript code. So when using React, we usually use JSX instead of normal JavaScript, because as you can see, JSX is simpler. Now, there is one problem with JSX, which is our web browser doesn't understand JSX. It only understands normal JavaScript. In order to use JSX, we need to translate it into normal JavaScript first, and then our web browser can understand this code. To do that, we use the Babel external library. Babel translates JSX into normal JavaScript, so our web browser can understand it. To use Babel, we need to do two steps. First, we load the Babel external library, which is what we do here. And then when we want to translate something into JavaScript, we have to give the script element an attribute type equals text/Babel. So this attribute tells Babel to translate all the code inside here into normal JavaScript. So that's what these two lines of code do. First, we load the Babel external library, and then we tell Babel to translate the code from JSX into normal JavaScript, so our web browser can understand it. So now we understand all of the code in our starting file. And again, this is the minimum amount of code that we need to set up React. Next, let's learn some more features of React. So we'll scroll back down, and currently we're using React to display some text inside this container. Now, in addition to text, we can also display HTML elements inside this container. So to do that, we're going to remove this string, and instead, we're going to give render an HTML element. So up here, we actually created an HTML element, or a button. So we're going to give this to the render function. So here, we're going to give it the button. And now it's going to display this button inside our container, or inside this div here. Let's save, and we'll open the browser, and open the tab for our website. and you'll see it displayed the button with the text hello on the website. And if we check the Elements tab, you can see that React displayed the button inside our container. We'll go back to our code. So that's what this code does. It displays an element inside this container. Now let's do another example. Let's display a different HTML element inside this container. So below this button, let's use JSX to create a paragraph element. So first we'll create a new variable using const, and we'll name the variable paragraph equals, and we'll create a paragraph element using the code less than p greater than less than slash p greater than. So this HTML code creates a paragraph or a paragraph of text. Inside our paragraph, let's just put paragraph of text. And now let's display this paragraph on our website. So inside render, instead of the button, we're going to render the paragraph and save. If we open our website, you can see it displayed a paragraph of text. If we go into the Elements tab and we open this div container, we can see that React displayed this paragraph element inside this container. So let's go back to our code. And that's basically how we use React. We give React a container, and then we can display an HTML element inside this container. Next, we're currently using React to display one element at a time on our website, which is not that useful. So now we're going to learn how to use React to display multiple elements on our website. So one thing we can't do is give render multiple elements. So this is not supported. We also can't save multiple elements inside a variable. This is also not supported. Instead, we need to use another HTML element called a div element. So under our paragraph, let's create a new variable using const, and let's name it div and make it equal, and we'll create an HTML div element using the code less than div greater than less than slash div greater than. So this is the HTML code to create a div element. As a review, the div element represents a container. The purpose of a div element is to contain other elements, like buttons and paragraphs. So that's actually why we used a div element up here. This element is a container. It's going to contain everything that we create using React. So let's go back down. Inside our div element, we can put other HTML elements, like a button. So let's actually select this code, and we'll copy, and then inside this div, paste. And let's also put a paragraph element inside our div. So we'll select this code for the paragraph element, and we'll copy, and inside our div, paste. So this code works because a div is considered as one element. So we're just taking one element and saving it in one variable, which is supported in JavaScript. The only thing special about this is that this one element can contain other elements inside. Next, we're going to give this div to the render function here. So instead of the paragraph, we're going to give render our div and save. And if we check our website, you can see that React displayed multiple elements on the website, a button and a paragraph. If we look at the Elements tab and open this div container, you can see that React displayed our div inside this container. Let's go back to our code. And that's how we display multiple elements on a website using React. First, we group the elements inside a div element, and then we render the div element. Before we continue, we're going to do some code cleanup. When we have multiple lines of HTML like this, a best practice is to add brackets around it. So at the front, we're going to add an open bracket, and at the end, a close bracket. And we're going to put the HTML on its own line. So here we have JavaScript and HTML together. We're going to add a new line here by pressing Enter, and we're going to put the HTML on its own line. Same thing here. Click here and press Enter to put the HTML on its own line. Next, we have two elements that are inside a div. So we're also going to give this line an indent by pressing Tab, and then we're going to give this line an indent by pressing Tab, so that it's easy to see that these two elements are inside this div element. So this is how we should format our code when we have multiple lines of HTML. Another way to think about this is inside here, you're actually just writing HTML normally. So don't worry, the more that you use React, the more you'll get used to this format. So let's save this file. Now that we learned the basics of React, let's talk about how React helps us create websites easier. If we look at this code, creating a website with React feels natural. It's a lot simpler than using the DOM feature in JavaScript. We can just create the HTML elements we want directly, and then give it to React, and React will display it on the website. Another benefit is JSX lets us find errors easier. For example, if I misspell button, it will actually tell me that these two don't match, because this is an actual element rather than just text or a string. So it makes it easier to find errors when we're coding. So I'll add the O back. Another benefit is we can insert values inside our JSX elements. For example, inside this paragraph, we're going to type space, and we're going to insert a value here by typing open curly bracket, close curly bracket. And inside here, we can give it any JavaScript code. For example, 2 plus 2. So this will calculate 2 plus 2 and then insert it into this element. If we save and then check our website, we can see that it calculated 2 plus 2, which is 4, and inserted it into this paragraph element. So we'll go back to our code, and that's another benefit of using React. We can insert JavaScript code directly into our JSX elements. So this is similar to string interpolation, where we can insert values into a string. Except here, we're inserting values into actual HTML elements. So those are 3 ways that React helps us create websites easier. Number 1, it's more natural. We can create the elements that we want and then just give it to React and it will put it on the website. Number 2, it helps us find errors easier because these are actual elements. And number 3, we can insert our JavaScript code into our elements. So this helps us use JavaScript and HTML together more easily. Now, React has many other features that helps us create websites easier, but we're going to learn those features later on as we go through the course. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to scroll up and we're just going to remove this example external library and save so that we just have the code that we need for React. And that's the end of this lesson. In this lesson, we learned that React is an external library that helps us create websites easier. We learned how to load the React external library. We learned how to set up React and use .render. We reviewed the basics of HTML and JavaScript. We learned JSX, an enhanced version of JavaScript. We created elements directly with JSX. And we learned how to insert values into our JSX elements. Here are some exercises to help you practice what we learned in this lesson. You can find the solutions to these exercises in the video description. In this lesson, we're going to learn two of the most important features of React, which are components and props. To learn this, I actually prepared a project that we can do for this lesson. We're going to go to our browser, and we can delete these extra tabs for now. And we're going to create a new tab. And at the top, we're going to go to supersimple.dev/projects/chatbot and press enter. This is a chatbot project. We can send a message to a robot up here, and the robot will respond to our message. For example, we can click in here and type "Hello, chatbot," and then press send. And the robot will respond with, "Hello, how can I help you?" Now, if we scroll to the bottom of this page, we can also move the text box to the bottom by clicking this link. So a lot of chatbot applications use this design, where the text box is at the bottom. However, because we're watching a video, this text box might get cut off, or it might be covered by the video progress bar. So just for this video, we're going to click this again, and we're going to start with the text box at the top. Next, this is a simple chatbot, and currently it can only do three things: get today's date, flip a coin, and roll a dice. For example, up here we can type, "Can you get me today's date?" and press send. And it will respond with today's date. And let's try typing, "How about flip a coin?" and press send. And it will respond with heads or tails. Finally, let's type, "Okay, thank you," and press send. And it responds with "no problem." So this is the chatbot project we're going to work on for the next few lessons. Now, this is a simple chatbot, and it can only do these three things. But in the future, we can also switch this to a more powerful AI that can respond to any message we send. But for now, we'll just use this simple chatbot to learn React. Now let's use React to build this chatbot project. We'll go back to VS Code, and let's make a copy of React Basics. So first, we'll select this file, and then right-click, copy, and inside here, we're going to right-click and paste. And let's rename this file. So we'll right-click and rename it to chatbot.html and press enter. And let's close the React Basics files for now. So we're going to start with the same code as the React Basics file, except we're just going to change the title up here. So we'll remove React Basics and just change it to chatbot and save. And now let's open this file in our browser. We'll right-click, open with a live server. And it should say chatbot in the tab up here. So now we can close the React Basics tabs, which are these two here. And we'll go back to VS Code. And now we're ready to begin the chatbot project. First, we're going to learn one of the most important features of React, called components. A component is just a piece of the website. For example, let's go back to our browser and open the Final Chatbot project. So looking at this project, we can split it up into different pieces. One piece can be the text box and the button at the top, and another piece are each of these chat messages. So these are called components. A component is just a piece of the website. Now, when building websites, it's better to split up the website into pieces or components so that we can work on a small piece of the website at a time. Now that we know what components are, let's create our first component in React. So we mentioned that one way we can split up this website is to have one component at the top for this text box and the button. So let's create a component for this in React. We'll go back to our code and we'll scroll down. And first, let's remove the example button and paragraph that we used. So we'll select this and remove it. And to create a component in React, we're going to use a function. So we'll type function, and now we're going to name this component. Since this piece of the website is for inputting a message and sending it to the chatbot, let's name this component capital C chat, capital I input, brackets and curly brackets. Now in React, the component name must start with a capital letter. So make sure that chat input starts with a capital C. This is also known as Pascal case, where each word in the name starts with a capital letter. Next, this function will return some HTML. So we're going to type return. And we're going to return the HTML for this piece of the website. So this piece of the website has a text box and a button. So let's type brackets and press enter between these brackets. And to create a text box, we're going to use the HTML element less than input greater than. And we also need to type less than / input greater than. Now you may notice that in normal HTML, input doesn't need this closing tag. However, JSX is more strict than normal HTML. So all elements need a closing tag, including input. Now, there's actually a shortcut we can use here. If there's nothing inside an element, we can actually remove the closing tag. And at the end of this opening tag, we can just type space and then /. So this code is a shortcut for this code. And this is called a self-closing element. So in JSX, we have to either have a closing tag or use this self-closing element shortcut. Next, this piece of the website also has a button. So let's also create a button element using less than, button greater than, less than / button greater than. And inside this button, we have the text send. And now we're going to get an error here because we're trying to return two values or two elements from this function. But we can only return one value from a function. To solve this problem, we can use a div element, like down here, to group these two elements together. So above this, let's create a div element. And at the bottom, less than / div greater than. And let's also add indents before these two lines. So we'll click here and press tab, and also click here and press tab. So this shows that these two elements are inside this div element. And now this code no longer has an error because we're returning one value from this function. Now that we created this component, let's learn how to display it on the website. If we scroll down, right now we're using React to display this div on the website. So all we have to do is to insert our component inside this div, and it will be displayed on the website. So one way to do this is to use curly brackets to insert something like we did before. So here, we'll type curly brackets, and now we're just going to run this function. Capital C, chat, input, and brackets. So this will run the function, and it will return this HTML from the function. And then the curly brackets will insert the HTML into the div, and then display it on the page. So as you can see, we can put any JavaScript code between these curly brackets. As long as this code results in a value, we can insert it into this HTML. Let's remove the button and the paragraph that we used as an example. and save. And let's check our website. We'll open the browser and go to our chatbot project. And now we created the elements for the top section of the chatbot project, the text box and the send button. So don't worry about how it looks for now. Later in the course, we're going to style this with CSS and make it look like the final project. Let's go back to our code. And next, React has a special syntax we can use to insert a component. Instead of using curly brackets and running the function, we can type this code, less than, and then the name of the component, capital C chat input, greater than, and then less than / chat input, greater than. So this is called the component syntax. This does the same thing as the code above. It runs the chat input function and then inserts the result into the HTML. If we save and we check our project, you'll notice that that syntax does the same thing, and it creates another text box and button. Let's go back to our code. And again, this code does the same thing as this code. Now, this syntax has a big advantage. This actually looks like an HTML element. It has an opening tag and a closing tag. So you can think of this like we're creating our own HTML element called chat input. HTML provides us with some default elements like div, input, and button. And now using React, we can actually create our own HTML element like chat input. Then we can use our own HTML elements to build the website instead of just the default HTML elements. And this is actually one of the main ideas of React. We can create our own HTML elements. So when using React, we should use this component syntax instead of running the component function directly, because this syntax lets us create our own HTML element. And again, we can use the self-closing element shortcut like we did up here. If there is nothing inside this element, we can remove this closing tag. And inside the opening tag, at the end, we can type space and slash. And now we can remove this example code above. And let's save and check our project. And that creates the top section of the chatbot project. So go back to VS Code. And we mentioned in the previous lesson that React helps us create websites easier. And this is another way that React helps us create websites easier. It lets us split our website into smaller pieces or components. And this lets us work on a small piece of the website at a time. Before we create the rest of the project, we're going to improve our code a little bit. First, notice that in this component, we're using a div to group these two elements together. However, this is also going to insert an extra div element into our website. So if we go to our website and right-click and click Inspect, and we're going to go to the Elements tab, and we're going to go to our container here, and we're going to expand it. So notice here that we have a bunch of extra divs on this website. So what if we don't want to insert these extra divs? What if we just want to insert the text box and the button on our website? Let's go back to our code and learn how to do that. React has another way to group elements together called a fragment. To use a fragment, we can remove the word div and div from the closing tag and just have a less than greater than and a less than slash greater than. So this is called a fragment, and it groups the two elements together so we can return it from the function, but it won't insert an extra div. So if we save this code and then go to our website and take a look at the HTML, you'll notice now we have one less extra div on the website. Let's go back, and we can also use a fragment down here. If we don't want to insert this extra div, we can remove it and remove it at the bottom and just use a fragment. If we save and check the website, now we no longer have those extra divs. We have our container, and we just inserted the text box and the button. So that's fragments. It allows us to group elements together without creating an extra div. Let's go back to our code. And since this variable no longer contains a div, let's rename it. So right now we're building a chatbot application or an app. So let's rename this variable to app instead. And here as well, we're going to render the app and save. So again, in React, when returning multiple elements or saving multiple elements, we can use a fragment to group them together. And this makes our HTML a little bit cleaner because it doesn't create an extra div element. Next, another improvement we can make is to add a placeholder to the text box at the top. So the gray text inside the text box is called a placeholder. It tells us what to type inside the text box. And when we start typing, it will disappear. To create a placeholder, we give this input element an attribute. So at the end, we're going to type the attribute placeholder equals double quotes. And then inside these double quotes, we're going to put the text that we want, which is send a message to chatbot. If we save this code and look at our website, now we have a placeholder in the text box. And when we start typing in it, it will disappear. So the placeholder is working. Now there is one problem here, which is if we remove this text, you'll notice that this placeholder is too long and it's getting cut off. To fix this, let's make this text box wider. We'll go back to our code. And to make this input wider, we're going to give it another attribute. So at the end, we'll type another attribute called size equals double quotes. And this sets how many characters can fit in this input. By the way, a character is just a letter, number, or symbol. Let's set the size to 30 characters and save and take a look. Okay, so that looks pretty good for now. Again, don't worry about how this looks. We'll style it later in the course using CSS. So we just created our first component, or our first piece of the website, which is the section at the top. Now let's get some practice and create more components. Let's go back to the final chatbot project. And let's ask ourselves, how can we split up the rest of this website into pieces? Another piece of this website could be one chat message here. So let's create a component for this piece of the website. We'll go back to VS Code. And to create a component, we're going to use a function. So down here, let's create a function. And let's name it capital C chat, capital M message, brackets and curly brackets. So remember, a component name must start with a capital letter, and we use Pascal case. So each word starts with a capital letter. Now, inside this function, we're going to return the HTML for this piece of the website or this component. So let's also type brackets and enter. So we can write the HTML on multiple lines. And now each chat message has two things, some text and a profile image. Since we have multiple things inside this component, let's group them together using a fragment so we can return one value from this function. So we'll type less than, greater than, enter, and then less than / greater than to create a fragment. And now inside here, each message has some text. So let's create the first chat message in our project. We'll go back to the final project, and let's just copy paste the text from the first message here, which is hello chatbot. So we'll select this and then copy by pressing Ctrl C on Windows or Command C on Mac. And then inside our code, in the chat message component, we're going to paste by pressing Ctrl V on Windows or Command V on Mac. And let's fix the indent by pressing Tab at the start. Next, each chat message has a profile image. To create an image, we can use an HTML element called img. So let's create a new line, and we're going to type less than img greater than, and then less than / img greater than. So remember that in JSX, every element has to have a closing tag. And again, we can use the self-closing element shortcut like we did down here. If there's nothing inside this element, we can remove the closing tag and then just add a space and a slash at the end of the opening tag. And now we have the two things that we need for each chat message, the text and an image. Next, we need to tell the computer which image to load. Right now, if we look at our final chatbot project, we have two images that we use, but we currently don't have these in our project. So let's download them. We're going to right-click this first image and then click Save Image. And we're going to find the folder that contains all of our code. So for me, it's on the desktop, and it's in the folder React-Course, and we're going to save it inside this folder. And same things for this robot image. We're going to right-click and click Save Image, go to the React-Course folder, and we're also going to save the robot image. And now if we look at our code, we should have two images inside our project, user.png and robot.png. And now let's go back to our code. To load an image on the website, we need to tell the computer which image to load. To do that, we're going to give this image element an attribute called src, or source, equals double quotes. And inside these double quotes, we're going to tell the computer which image to load. For the first chat message, the image is the user image. So let's type this file name, user.png. So this will look for a file called user.png beside the current HTML file. This is the current HTML file, so we'll look for user.png beside it, which is right here. And then it's going to load this image on the website. Okay, so we created a component for a chat message. Now let's insert this component on the website. We're going to scroll down to the app, and let's insert this component using the component syntax like we did up here. So we'll type a new line and type less than, and then the name of the component, which is capital C chat, capital M message. And currently we don't have anything to put inside this component, so we use the self-closing element shortcut like we did up here. So now let's save and check our website, which is this tab. And let's close the console so we can see it. And we created a chat message. However, we have a few problems here. The first problem is that the profile image is too big. To make it smaller, we're going to go back to our code. And inside the img element, we're going to give it another attribute called width equals double quotes. And let's try setting the width to 50 and save. And then check our website. And that looks close enough. Another problem is the chat message is appearing on the same line as the chat input, but in the final project, we want it to appear below. To fix this, we'll go back to our code, and inside the chat message component, instead of using a fragment to group these elements together, we're going to change it back to a div. So inside, we'll type div, and inside here, /div. The reason we're using a div is because in HTML, a div is known as a block element. A block element will always take up an entire line by itself. So if we group this in a div element, instead of appearing beside the chat input, the div is going to take up an entire line by itself. So it's going to take up the entire line under the chat input. So let's save this code and then check our website. So now this div is taking up this entire line. If we right-click and click Inspect, and then click this arrow icon in the top left, and then click on this div, you can see that this div now takes up this entire line. So now we have the layout that we want. So in React, we still use divs for layout purposes. If you want to learn divs, layout, and HTML in more detail, you can check out my HTML and CSS full course in the video description. So now we created our first chat message. Next, let's create the second chat message. We'll go back to our code. And instead of creating a whole new component, we can actually reuse our chat message component. Components are actually designed to be reusable. To reuse this component, we don't want the message to be hello chatbot every time. We want to be able to display different messages in this component. To do that, we can give our component an attribute. So down here, we're going to go to the chat message component, and we're going to give it an attribute. So this works just like HTML attributes. We're going to give our attribute a name. Let's call it message equals double quotes. And inside these double quotes, we're going to give the attribute a value. Let's put the text for the first message, which is hello chatbot. So let's select this code and then copy, and we're going to paste it inside here. So now we have an attribute called message with the value hello chatbot. So again, you can see that this syntax looks like HTML. We can even add our own attributes. Now that we added this message attribute, how do we access it inside this component and use it? To do that, we're going to use a feature called props. Every component function gets one parameter up here called props. This props parameter is an object, and it contains all the attributes that we give to this component. So up here, let's actually console.log props to see what it looks like. Let's save and then open our website and check the console. And you'll see that props is an object, and it contains the attributes that we gave to our component. So here we have the message attribute, and it has a value hello chatbot. So the attribute name is saved as a property, and the attribute's value is saved as the value of this object. So let's go back to VS Code. And using this props object, we can access our attributes. By the way, props is short for properties. We call this props because the attributes are saved as properties in this object. So now to access the message attribute, we can remove this and type props dot and the attribute name, which is message. And let's save this in a variable so we can use it later. So at the front, we'll create a variable using const, name it message equals props.message. And we'll add a new line to separate the code a little bit. Now, instead of displaying hello chatbot every time, let's display whatever's in the message attribute. So we'll remove this, and let's insert this variable into this element. To do that, we can use curly brackets and type the variable name message. So again, we can put any JavaScript code between these curly brackets, and as long as it results in a value, it will insert it into this element. So now let's save, and we'll check the website, and it displays a message, hello chatbot. That's the message attribute that we gave it. Let's go back to our code. So that's props. Just like a normal HTML element, we can give attributes to our component and then access these attributes using this props object. So props are really useful because props make our component reusable. For example, let's try creating the second chat message. To do that, we can just create another chat message component. So down here, let's type less than chat message / greater than. And we just need to give it a different message attribute. So here, we'll give it an attribute message equals double quotes, and we'll copy paste the second message in the chatbot project. We'll go to our browser and go to the chatbot project, and let's copy and paste this second message. We'll select it and then copy, and inside our code, in the message attribute, we're going to paste. So this will save the message, hello, how can I help you, inside props. And then we get it out of props and insert it into the component. Let's save and check the website and go to our tab. And now we created the second chat message. So let's go back to our code. And you can see that props make our component reusable. We can reuse this component, but just give it a different attribute or prop, and it will display a different message. Let's get some practice and use props to create 2 more chat messages. Feel free to pause if you want to try it yourself first. So down here, let's create our third message using less than chat message / greater than, and we'll give it a message attribute equals double quotes, and we'll copy paste the third message. We'll go to the chatbot project and select this third message, and then copy, and in our code, inside the attribute, we're going to paste. And finally, let's create the fourth message, less than chat message / greater than, and then the message attribute equals double quotes, and we'll copy paste the fourth message, which is this one. So don't worry if your messages are different from mine. We're just doing an example. So we'll select this and copy, and inside here, we're going to paste and save. And now if we check our website and go to our tab, you'll see that we now have 4 chat messages in our project. So that's how we use props to reuse the chat message component. Next, in the final chatbot project, notice that these 2 messages are different. These 2 messages are from the chatbot. So there are 2 differences here. The profile image is a robot, and the image is on the left. To create this, we can add another prop to chat message. Let's go back to VS Code. And for each chat message, we're going to add another attribute. And let's call this attribute the sender equals double quotes. This attribute tells us who sent the message, and we can use this to determine which image to load and where to place the image. So if we sent the message, let's make the sender the user. And for the second chat message, we're going to add another sender attribute equals double quotes. And the second message is from the chatbot. So let's make the sender attribute the robot. And we'll do the same thing for the third and fourth message. We'll give it a sender attribute. The third message is from the user. So let's make the sender user. And the fourth message, sender equals double quotes. This message is from the robot. So let's make the sender robot. Next, let's access the sender attribute inside our component. To do that, all the attributes are saved inside this props object. To access the sender attribute, we can type props.sender. So this gives us the value of the sender attribute, which is either user or robot. So let's save this in a variable so we can use it later. Type const, and let's call it sender equals props.sender. So now that we have the sender attribute, let's use it to decide which profile image to load and where to place this image. To do that, we can just use an if statement. So inside here, we can type if brackets and curly brackets. And inside these brackets, we're going to check if the sender is equal to the string robot. By the way, by default, if the attribute just has double quotes like this, the value is a string. So here, the value is going to be the string user or the string robot. So now inside our component, if the sender is the robot, we're going to return some different HTML. So let's type return brackets so we can write this HTML on multiple lines. And let's just copy paste the HTML from down here and modify it. So we'll select this HTML and then copy. And then inside this return, we're going to paste. And let's also select these lines and press tab to fix the indenting. So the first thing we need to change if the sender is a robot is that we want to load the robot image instead. So we already downloaded the robot image here. To load it, we're just going to change the src attribute or the source attribute of this image. So we're going to change this from user to robot.png. And we also want this image to be on the left. So let's just move this image before the message. So we'll select this code and then cut by pressing Ctrl X on Windows or Command X on Mac. And then before the message, we're going to paste by pressing Ctrl V on Windows or Command V on Mac. And we can remove this extra new line. So as you can see, inside a component, we can use any JavaScript feature like if statements, and we can return a different HTML. And whatever we return will be inserted inside the element here. So now let's save this code and then check our website and then open our tab. And you can see that now we have two messages from the chatbot that loads the robot image and it puts the image on the left. We'll go back to our code. And using this sender prop, we're able to reuse this component to create a chat message from the robot. So again, props make our component reusable. And that's it. If we scroll down, using components, we split up the website or the app into smaller pieces, like the chat input section at the top and each chat message. And we created all the HTML that we need for this project. The last thing we're going to learn in this lesson are some shortcuts that are commonly used in React. And we can use these to clean up our code. First, let's scroll up to the chat message component. So instead of doing const message equals props.message, we actually have a shortcut for this in JavaScript. So down here, we can just type const curly brackets And inside, we can type message and make it equal to props. So this takes the message property out of this object and saves it in a variable called message. So this does the same thing as this line above. This code is a shortcut for this code. And this shortcut is called destructuring because we're taking stuff out of this object. We're deconstructing it. We can also use this shortcut with the sender property. To add another property to take out of this object, after the first property, we can type comma, and the second property, sender. So this will get the message property and the sender property out of this object, and it will save it in a message variable and a sender variable. So this line of code is a shortcut for these two lines above. So now let's actually turn these two lines into comments, or comment out these lines. At the front, we're going to type double slash, and at the front here, we'll type double slash. By the way, if we start with double slash, it will turn this code into comments, and it will be ignored by the computer. So we'll just keep this here as a reminder that this is a shortcut for these two. Next, JavaScript has an even shorter shortcut for this. Since props is a parameter up here, we can just destructure it directly up here. So here, instead of the props object, we can just type curly brackets directly, and then type message, comma, and sender. This takes the message and sender properties directly out of the first parameter, and then saves them in a variable called message and a variable called sender. So it does the same thing as this code down here, but it's an even shorter shortcut. We're destructuring the parameter directly at the top. So this shortcut is used a lot in React tutorials and documentation. So it's useful to know how this works. So let's comment out this line here. At the front, we'll type double slash. So we remember that this code is a shortcut for this line of code and these two lines of code. Now let's save and check our website to make sure that everything is still working. So that looks good. We'll go back, and that is the destructuring shortcut. It allows us to take properties directly out of an object. Next, we're going to learn how to use if statements directly inside JSX. So currently, we have some JSX here, and we put an if statement outside of this JSX. However, this means we're duplicating some code, like the div and the message. To make this code more reusable, we can actually move this if statement directly inside the JSX down here. So what we want to do is, if the sender is a robot, we want to put the image before the message. So down here, let's go before the message and press enter. And we're going to type curly brackets, and we're going to insert the if statement directly inside here. So here, before the message, we want to do something like if the sender is equal to the string robot, we're going to insert this image. However, we can't actually use the word if inside of these curly brackets. Instead, we need to use another feature of JavaScript called a guard operator, or AND. In JavaScript, you can write value 1 and value 2. If value 1 is true, then the result will be value 2. So this works just like an if statement, except we can write it on one line, and it results in a value. So if you want to learn more about this feature, I cover it in the Booleans lesson of my JavaScript course, and you can check out that in the video description. For now, the only thing we need to know is we can use AND as sort of an if statement in our JSX. So first, let's remove this. And then we're going to use AND to insert this if statement directly inside the JSX. So the first value is going to be our if condition, which is sender equals the robot. So we'll check if the sender is equal to the string robot, and then we're going to use and. So if this is true, the result is going to be the second value here. So here, if the sender is a robot, we want to insert the robot image. So let's just copy and paste this code. We're going to select this, and then copy it. And then down here, after and, we're going to paste. So again, the way this works is if the value on the left is true, then the result will be the value on the right. So this and is sort of a shortcut for this if statement, and it lets us insert if statements directly inside our JSX. So let's actually comment out this if statement out here. So we remember that this code is a shortcut for this code. So here, before the if statement, we'll type slash and star, and after the if statement, we'll type star and slash, and remove the indent. So this is known as a multi-line comment. All the code between these two stars will be ignored by the computer. So now let's save and check our website. And as you can see, if the sender is a robot, we're going to add an image on the left before the message. So now one problem here is that we're also showing the user's profile image at the back, but we only want to show one profile image. We'll go back to our code. And here, we only want to show the user profile image if the sender is the user. So let's insert another if statement down here. Feel free to pause this video if you want to try it yourself first. So at the front, we'll type open curly bracket. At the end, a close curly bracket. And at the front, we're going to type the if condition. So we'll check if the sender is equal to the string user, and then we'll type and. So if this is true, then we will show this image. If this is not true, we will not show this image. So this code is a shortcut for this code. Let's save and check our website. And it works. The robot image is on the left, and the user image is on the right. So let's go back. Using the guard operator, or and, we can insert an if statement directly inside our JSX. Next, we're going to do some code cleanup. So let's scroll up, and we're going to go to the chat input component first. So you notice that in here, this line is a little bit too long. To make our code easier to read, we can actually put each attribute on its own line. So here, we'll type enter to put placeholder on its own line, and here we'll type enter to put size on its own line. And let's also type enter at the back, so the attributes are on their own lines. And then let's add an indent in front of these attributes by pressing tab and pressing tab. This makes it clear that these attributes are part of this element. And we also want to make sure that these two are vertically aligned. This makes it easy to see where this element starts and where it ends. Next, let's scroll down to the chat message component. And notice that these two lines of code with the and are also a bit too long. To improve this, we can surround this value with brackets. So we'll type open bracket, and at the end, close bracket. And then we can put this code on its own line. So here, we'll type enter, and at the end, we'll type enter. So this will still have the same value, but the brackets allow us to put the code on multiple lines. We'll do the same thing for the second image. We'll surround it in brackets, open bracket, and close bracket, and we'll put this value on a separate line so that it's no longer too long. Next, let's scroll down even more to the app variable. And you'll notice that these lines are also a bit too long because of the attributes. Again, we can put each attribute on its own line. So here, we'll put message on its own line and sender on its own line. And we'll put the end of the component on its own line so that this is vertically aligned with this. And let's also add indents before the attributes. So we'll press tab and tab. So it's easy to see that these attributes are part of this component. And we'll do the same thing for the other 3 chat messages. So we'll put this on its own line and add indents. And put this on its own line, add indents, and put this on its own line and add indents. And save. And check our website, and everything should still work because we just changed the formatting of our code. So let's go back. And that's how we avoid our lines being too long. We can put each attribute on its own line, and we can also surround a value with brackets and put it on its own line. Finally, down here, instead of using a variable to save our app, a best practice is to use a component to create this app. So here, let's create a component using function. And we'll name it capital A app, brackets and curly brackets. And then this component will return all of this HTML. So we'll return brackets so we can write it on multiple lines. And we're going to move all this code up here. So let's select this code and we'll cut. And inside the return, we're going to paste. And we can select these lines and press tab to fix the indenting. So now we're going to use this component instead of the variable to create our app. So down here, let's remove this variable. And then inside render, we're going to create the app. We can type less than capital A app greater than, and then less than / app greater than. So this creates an entire chatbot application. And then we give this to React to display on the website. And again, since there's nothing inside this component, we can use the self-closing element shortcut. So we can remove this closing tag. And then at the end here, we can type space and /. And now let's save and check our website. And it displays the app on the website. Let's go back to our code. So a best practice is to use a component called app to create the website, because it gives us access to extra features of components like props. And also notice that we can have components inside a component. So this lets us split up a website into smaller and smaller components, or smaller and smaller pieces. So again, React helps us create websites easier because it lets us work on a small piece of the website at a time. In the next lesson, we're going to learn a very important feature of React called state. State lets us make our website interactive, and it will let us add new chat messages to our website. And that's the end of this lesson. In this lesson, we learned that a component is just a piece of the website. We also learned that components let us create our own HTML elements. We started the chatbot project. We split the chatbot into chat input and chat message components. We learned props, which let us insert values into components and make components reusable. We learned the destructuring and guard operator shortcuts. We did some code cleanup and split longer lines into multiple lines. And we created an app component, which represents the entire application. Thanks for watching so far. If you find this course valuable, you can support the channel by liking this video, leaving a comment, and subscribing. You can also check out the premium version of this course, where you'll get all the lessons ads-free, broken down into small videos, as well as additional lessons and more projects that are not in the public React course. Currently, the premium course contains 11 lessons, and I'll be adding more lessons in the future. You can also get a certificate of completion, create comments or questions on specific topics, get progress tracking, search, and course notes. You can also check out the membership, where you can get this course ads-free, separated by each lesson, AI videos, backend tutorials, and more. Thanks again, and let's continue with the course. Here are some exercises to help you practice what we learned in this lesson. In this lesson, we're going to learn two of the most important features of React, called state and event handlers. And we're going to use these features to create the functionality for the chatbot project. Before we learn state, we're going to improve our code a bit. Currently, to add a new chat message, we have to manually type a new chat message component. Instead of manually typing this code, we can actually use JavaScript to generate these components. To do that, we're going to do two steps. The first step is to save the data. Data means information. Here, the data is the information about our chat messages, like the message and the sender. So we need to save this data or this information in our JavaScript. Let's use a variable to save this data. At the top of this component, we're going to create a variable using const, and we'll name it chat messages equals, and we'll save it as an array by typing square brackets. As a review, an array is a list of values. So here, we want to save a list of chat messages, so it makes sense to save it as an array. Next, each chat message has multiple pieces of data, like the message and the sender. So inside this array, we're going to save each chat message as an object by typing curly brackets. As a review, an object groups related values together. So it's going to help us group the message and the sender together. And then inside this object, we're going to create a property called message, colon, and a string, and we're going to use this to save the message. So let's copy the first message. We'll select it and copy, and we're going to paste it in here. And then we'll add a comma, and we're going to add a sender property, colon, and a string, and we're going to save the first sender, which is the user. So that's how we save the data for the first chat message in our JavaScript. Now let's save the data for the second chat message. So after the first object, we're going to type comma and create another object. I will give this one a message property as well, colon, a string, and we'll save the second message. We'll select this, copy, and then inside here, we're going to paste, add a comma, and a sender property, colon, and a string. And the second chat message is from the robot. So inside the sender, we'll save robot. Let's do the same thing for the third and fourth chat messages. We'll save them in our JavaScript. Feel free to pause the video if you want to try it yourself. So for the third chat message, we're going to add a comma at the end and another object, a message property, a string, and we're going to copy the third message and paste it in here. And a sender property. The third message is from the user. And then we're going to type comma and another object, the message property, colon, and a string, and we'll copy paste the fourth message. So we'll select it, copy, and then inside here, we're going to paste. And a sender property. And the fourth message is from the robot. So that's how we save the data or the information for the chat messages. After we save the data, the second step is to generate the HTML. So we're going to use JavaScript to convert this data into these components, so we don't have to type these components manually. To do that, after the data, we're going to type the name of the data, which is chat messages, and this is an array. And arrays have a feature called dot map and brackets. As a review, dot map lets us go through each value of an array and convert it into a new value. To use dot map, we need to give it a function. So between these brackets, we're going to type a function using brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. As a review, this is an arrow function. It mostly works the same way as a function, but it's shorter. When we give a function to another function like .map, we usually use an arrow function because it makes the code a bit cleaner. This is what React tutorials and documentations use. Next, this function gets a parameter. So at the top, we'll create a new parameter and name it chat message. So now .map takes each value in this array and converts it into a new value. The way it works is it starts with the first value and then it saves it in this parameter and runs this function. And whatever we return from this function will be the new first value. Then it takes the second value and saves it in this parameter and runs the function, and whatever we return from the function will be the new second value. Then it takes the third value, saves it, runs the function, and whatever we return will be the new third value, and so on. So .map basically goes through each value in this array, runs the function, and converts it into a new value. So here, we want to convert each chat message object into a chat message component. So inside this inner function, we're going to return a chat message component by typing brackets, and then here, less than chat message / greater than to return a chat message component. Next, each chat message component has two props, message and sender. So we're going to add those props to this component. So here, we'll create a prop message equals, and now what do we save in this prop? Remember that .map takes each object in this array and saves it in this parameter. So this parameter contains a chat message object. And each chat message object has a message and a sender. So we want to save the message inside this prop. To do that, we're going to type curly brackets. And inside, we'll type this object, chat message, and get the message property, which is .message. This gets the message out of this object and saves it in the prop. So why do we use curly brackets here instead of double quotes? If we use double quotes, it will save a string into this prop, which is not what we want. But if we use curly brackets, it will save the result of this code into this prop. So for the first chat message, the result of chat message.message is going to be the string hello chatbot. So it's going to take this and save it into the message prop here. For the second chat message, the result of this code is hello, how can I help you? And it will save this into the message prop, and so on. So using curly brackets, we can put any JavaScript code inside, and it will save the result of this code into the prop, not just a string. So next, each chat message component has a sender prop. So here, we're also going to add a sender equals, and again, we want to save the sender property of this chat message object. So we'll type curly brackets and the object chat message dot sender. So this will get the sender property out of each chat message object and save it in here. And that's it. Now map will take each value of this array and convert it into a chat message component. And here's what the result looks like. Next, we're going to save the result of this code in a variable. So up here, let's type const, and we'll name the variable chat message components equals this code. And now we have an array of components, or a list of components. Finally, we're going to insert this array into the JSX. So down here, we can actually remove all of these chat message components because we're generating them now. And we're going to type curly brackets, and we're going to insert this array. In here, we'll type chat message components. If we insert an array of components, React will just display all of these components on the page. If we save and then go to our project, it displays all the chat message components that we generated with our JavaScript. So now we're generating this HTML with JavaScript, and we no longer have to type out each component manually. Now there's one more thing that's useful to know. Let's go back to our code. And there's actually a shortcut that we can use here. Instead of saving this result in a variable, we can actually just insert this result directly in the JSX. So we'll select this code and then cut, and between the curly brackets, we're going to remove the variable and just paste that code. And we'll remove the semicolon at the end, and we'll select this code and press tab a few times to fix the indenting. And finally, we can remove this variable up here. Now, we're just inserting the result of this code directly in the JSX. This shortcut is used a lot in React tutorials and documentation, so it's useful to know how it works. Now let's save and then check our website, and everything still works. So that's how we generate the HTML. Before we move on, there's actually an issue that we need to fix here. If we look at our console and we scroll up, we'll see an error saying each child in a list should have a unique key prop. In React, if we insert an array of components, we need to give each component a prop called key. The key helps React track changes in the array, so we should give each component a key. Let's go back to VS Code. And for each chat message, we're going to add a prop called key. equals, and this key has to be unique. So what should we use as the key? Usually, when we have some data like this, in the real world, each piece of data should have a unique ID that lets us identify it. So let's add a unique ID to each message to match what we would see in the real world. So for the first message, after the sender, we'll add a property called ID, colon, and let's just make it a string ID1 to keep it simple. For the second message, we'll add an ID with the string ID2. For the third message, we'll make the ID ID3, and for the fourth message, we'll add an ID string ID4. So we'll use these IDs for practice. They just have to be unique. And now we'll use this unique ID as the key. So down here, we'll set the key to be equal to curly brackets, and we'll get the chat message dot ID. So chat message dot ID. Again, we use curly brackets here because we want to save the result of this code as the key. And now each component in this array will have a unique key. Let's save and check our website. And now the error is gone from the console. Let's go back to our code. And now we have a lot of code in our app component. To make our code easier to work with, we're going to separate this code into smaller pieces. Notice that this code and this code are related to chat messages. So it makes sense to separate these two pieces of code into a chat messages component. So we'll scroll up. Above app, let's create a new component using function, and we'll name it capital C chat, capital M messages, brackets and curly brackets. And now we're going to move all the code related to chat messages into this new component. So we'll select this code and cut. And inside here, we're going to paste and create some new lines. And we're going to select this code and cut. And inside here, we're going to paste. And at the end of this component, we need to return the HTML. So at the end, we're going to return open bracket, and we'll remove the close bracket for now. And we're going to use a fragment to group all of these components together. So we'll type less than, greater than, and at the end of this, less than / greater than. And we'll add the close bracket at the end. And finally, we can fix the indenting by pressing tab. And we'll remove the indent here and here as well, so that these are vertically aligned. Finally, now that we have this chat messages component, we're going to insert this into our app. So we'll scroll down into app and remove these lines. And to insert the chat messages component, we'll use the component syntax again. Less than, capital C chat, capital M messages, / greater than. So now we just separated all that code into its own component, and it makes our code much cleaner. Let's save and check our website. And everything still works. We just reorganized our code into a chat messages component. Okay, so far we saved the data and we generated the HTML. The last step to building a website is to make it interactive. For example, when we click this send button, we want to add a chat message to the website. To make this website interactive, we're going to use event handlers. An event handler lets us run a function when we interact with the website. Let's do an example. we'll go back to our code, and we're going to scroll up to the chat messages component. And then inside this fragment, we're going to create a new line, and let's create a new button using less than, button greater than, and less than slash button greater than. And inside this button, let's put the text send message. So we'll create a new button for practice. Next, we're going to give this button a special prop. So here, we'll add a new prop called on capital C click equals curly brackets. So on click lets us run a function when we click this button. So above this, let's create a function to run. So we'll type function, and let's name it send message, brackets and curly brackets. And inside this function, let's just console.log the string send message. Now that we have this function, we're going to save this function inside onClick. So between these curly brackets, we're going to give the name of the function, send message. So notice that again, we used curly brackets. Curly brackets lets us save any type of value in a prop, including a function. Now that we gave onClick this function, when we click this button, it's going to run this function and console.log this message. Let's save, and we'll go to our website and try clicking this new send message button. And this will run the function and display the message send message in the console. Let's go back to our code, and we'll learn more details about event handlers. So onClick is known as the event, and send message is known as the event handler. It does something when this event happens, or it handles the event. Now there's two other things to note. The event prop always starts with on, and then the name of the event, like click. And the event prop must use camel case. As a review, camel case means the first word is lowercase, and all other words start with a capital. So that's why on is lowercase, and click starts with a capital C. Another thing we should know is that here, we should not run the event handler function. So we should not use brackets. So this will run the function, and then the result of the function will be undefined. And then it's going to save undefined into onClick, which doesn't work. Instead, we should just give the function directly to onClick without running it. So that's event handlers. An event handler lets us run a function when we interact with a website, and they make the website interactive. Next, when we click this button, instead of just console.log, let's add a new chat message. To do that, we can add a new object to the chat messages array up here. So inside this function, let's remove console.log and then type the name of the array, chat messages, and then use the code .push and brackets. As a review, .push adds a value to the end of an array. So inside here, we're going to add another object using curly brackets. And each object will have a message property. So we'll type message, colon, and then a string. And for our new message, let's just make the message test. And we'll add a comma, and we'll add a sender property. Sender, colon, a string, and this message will be from the user, comma, and we'll give it an ID, colon, and let's just use the string ID 5. Now, there's one problem with using ID 5 in this situation. Every message that we create when we click this button is going to have the ID 5. but the ID should be unique. To create a unique ID, we can use some JavaScript code. So instead of ID5, we're going to use the code crypto.random capital U, capital U, capital I, capital D, and brackets. So this is some JavaScript code that will generate a unique ID string every time we run this code. So now every message that we create using this button will have a unique ID. At the end, let's create some new lines and let's console.log the chat messages array to see if it has a new message. Let's save and we'll go to our website and we'll click send message. And now inside chat messages, we have 5 messages. So we added this last one here. It has the message test, and notice it has a unique ID. So we successfully added a chat message when clicking this button. Next, notice that even though we updated the data, it did not update the website. So it did not display a new chat message component on the website. To fix this, we're going to learn one of the most important features of React, called state. State is data that is connected to the HTML. When we update this data, it will update the HTML. Let's go back to our code. And if we scroll up, currently chat messages is just a normal variable. When we update chat messages, it will not update the HTML. However, if we convert chat messages into state, when we update chat messages, it will update the HTML. So now let's learn how to convert chat messages into state. At the top of this component, we're going to use this code. Capital R React dot use capital S state and brackets. And between the brackets, we're going to give it the chat messages data. So we're going to select this data and cut. And between these brackets, we're going to paste. So this will convert this data into state. So now if we update this data, it will also update the HTML. So at the bottom here, we can remove the chat messages variable because we converted it into state. Next, React.useState returns an array. So at the front, let's save the result in a variable. Const array equals React.useState. This array has 2 values. To get the first value, we can click here to collapse the code for now. And to get the first value, we're going to type the name of the array, and then square brackets 0. So remember, an array is a list of values, and square bracket 0 gets us the first value in the list or in the array. So the first value we get from useState is the current data. So here, chat messages can change over time. It's going to start off as this value, which is the initial value. And then we might add new chat messages in the future. So the first value in this array gives us the current value of chat messages, or the current data. Let's save this in a variable so we can use it later. We'll do const, and let's name it chat messages equals array 0. So now we have the most current chat messages, and we can use it down here to generate the HTML. Next, useState gives us a second value in this array. To get the second value, we're going to type array square bracket 1. And the second value of this array is a function that updates this data. So let's save this function in a variable using const, and the naming convention for this function is to use set, and then the name of the data, which is capital C chat, capital M messages, equals this value. And we should also use camel case here. So the first word starts with a lowercase, and every other word starts with a capital. So this function lets us update the data. In React, we should not update the data directly, like we did down here using .push. We should always use this function to update the data. And that's because this function tells React that the data changed and to update the HTML. If we update the data directly, React will not update the HTML. If we use this function to update the data, React will update the HTML. So we should always use this function to update the data. This is also known as the updater function. So now let's give it a try. Instead of updating this data directly, we're going to use this updater function by typing set chat messages and brackets. And between the brackets, we're going to put the new value of chat messages. So the way that this updater function works is it's going to replace the entire chat messages array with a new array. So let's give it a try. First, we need to make a copy of this array. In React, we should not modify the data directly. We should always create a copy of the data and then modify the copy. This helps React be more efficient. To create a copy, we're going to click between these brackets and create a new array using square brackets. And to copy chat messages, we can use this code, ... and the array that we want to copy, which is chat messages. As a review, this is a JavaScript feature called the spread operator. It basically takes the values in an array and then copies them into a new array. You can think of it like we're taking the values in this array and then spreading them out into this new array. That's why it's called the spread operator. The spread operator is used a lot in React tutorials and documentation, so it's useful to know how it works. So we created a copy of chat messages, and now we want to add a new chat message at the end of this copy because we're trying to send a new message. To do that, we can just add a comma at the end and then add a new chat message directly using curly brackets. So each chat message has a message property, colon, and we'll give it the string test for now. And each chat message has a sender property, colon, and let's make the sender the user. And we'll give each chat message an ID. And to create a unique ID, we can use crypto.random capital U, capital U, capital I, capital D, and brackets. So using the spread operator, we made a copy of the chat messages array, and then we added a value at the end of this new array. And now this updater function will replace chat messages with this new array. And because we use this updater function, React will regenerate the HTML. So it will basically rerun all this code, and it will update the website. So now let's save, and let's check our website, and we'll press send message. It will create a new chat message in our data, and it will also update the HTML. So it will create a new chat message component and display it on the website. Now let's go back. And that is how state works. Let's do a short review. State is basically data that is connected to the HTML. When we update this data or we update the state, it will update the HTML. To convert some data into state, we use react.useState. So here, it will convert this data into state. And useState gives us two values. The first value is the current data. And then the second value is a function to update this data. If we use the updater function, it will also update the HTML. So don't worry if state is a little bit confusing at first. The more you work with state, the more you get used to it. And we'll do more examples of state in this course and in the exercises, so you can get more practice. Next, we're going to learn a shortcut called array destructuring. Here, we get the first value out of this array and save it in a variable called chat messages. Now, JavaScript actually has a shortcut for this. Above this, we can type const and then square bracket equals this array. And inside the square brackets, we can type chat messages. So this is similar to object destructuring. This gets the first value out of this array and saves it in a variable called chat messages. So this code is a shortcut for this code. We can also get the second value out of this array. At the end here, we can type comma and then another variable name. Let's use set chat messages. So this gets the second value out of this array and saves it in a variable called set chat messages. So this code is a shortcut for these two lines of code. And this shortcut is called array destructuring because we're taking stuff out of this array. We're deconstructing it. Now, in array destructuring, the order matters. So this will always get the first value out of the array, and this will always get the second value out of the array. So now let's comment out these two lines, so we remember that this is just a shortcut. So we'll type double slash at the front, and here double slash at the front. Now another shortcut we can use is instead of saving the result of useState in this variable and then destructuring it, we can just destructure this up here. So instead of array, we can just directly destructure using square brackets, and then the first value of useState is going to be chat messages, and the second value from useState is going to be the updater function, which is set chat messages. So this code is a shortcut for this code. We just don't save it in a variable in the middle. So at the front of this code, let's also comment it out using double slash. So that is array destructuring. It gives us an easier way to take values out of an array. Now this shortcut is used a lot in React tutorials and documentation, so it's useful to know how it works. Next, instead of adding the same message test every time, we should add whatever message is in the text box. So we'll learn how to get the text in a text box. In normal JavaScript, we might use the DOM to get the input element and then use a property called .value to get the text inside the text box. However, in React, a best practice is do not use the DOM manually. That's because React is managing the website. So if we use the DOM manually, it might interfere with React. Instead, we should use React features to get the text from a text box. One way to do this is we're going to scroll up to the text box, which is inside the chat input component, and it's the input element here. So to get the text in this text box, we can use a prop called onC change equals curly brackets. Earlier, we learned about the event onClick, which runs a function when we click an element. onChange is another event we can use in React. You can tell it's an event because it starts with on. So onChange runs a function when we change the text inside an input. So above this, let's create a function to run. We'll type function, and let's name it save input text, brackets and curly brackets, because we're going to save the text inside this input. And now let's save this function inside onChange. So between the curly brackets, we'll give it the function save input text. So again, we use curly brackets here because we want to save a function inside this prop rather than just a string. So now, every time we change the text in this input, it will run this function. Next, when onChange runs this function, it's going to give this function one parameter up here called event. Event is an object, and it contains details about the event or about the change. So one detail is event.target. And this gives us the element that we're typing in or that we changed. So in this case, it's going to give us this input element. So React gives us access to this input element automatically using event.target. And now to get the text inside this input, we're going to use the property .value. So now let's console.log this to see what it looks like. Console.log. And let's save our code. And we'll go back to our website. And we'll give it a try. So we'll click this text box. And we're going to type hello. And you'll see that every time we type or change the text, it will console.log the text in the text box. So that is how we get the text inside the text box using an onChange event. Let's go back to our code. And now we need to save this text so we can use it later when creating a chat message. To save this text, we're going to use state. In React, we should use state to save data that changes over time, like the text in the text box. So at the top of this component, let's use the code react.useState and brackets. And between the brackets, we're going to put the initial value. In this case, the initial value in the text box. The text box originally starts as empty. So let's set the value to the empty string. Next, useState returns an array with two values. So at the front, let's use array destructuring using const, and we'll type square brackets equals this result. And now to get the first value out of this array, inside the square brackets, we're going to type input text. So this is the current data or the current text in the text box. So that's why we name it input text. To get the second value out of this array, after this, we can type comma and give a name for the second value. So the naming convention is to use the word set and then the name of the data, which is capital I input, capital T text. So the second value is an updater function. It lets us update the data. Now that we set up the state, every time we change the text, we're going to save it up here inside input text. To do that, instead of console.log, we're going to use the updater function set input text. And now, every time we change the text, it's going to run this function, and it's going to save the text inside input text. Next, when we click the send button, we want to use this text to create a new chat message. First, we need to make the send button interactive. To do that, inside this button element, we're going to add the prop on click equals curly brackets. Again, on click lets us run a function when we click this button. And now above this, let's create a function to run. We'll use function, and let's name it send message, brackets and curly brackets. And we're going to give this function to onClick. So down here, we'll give the function name send message. Now, when we click this button, it will run this function. And let's just console.log input text to see what the value is. So in here, we'll console.log brackets the input text and save. And we'll go back to our website. And in the text box, we're going to type hello and then press send. And you'll see that it console.logs the text inside the text box. Next, we're going to create a new chat message using this text. Let's go back to our code. And if we scroll down in our code to the chat messages component, we already have code here that adds a new message to chat messages. So let's just select this code and we'll copy, and at the top, inside send message, we're going to paste. And we can remove this console.log. And we'll scroll back down. And we created this function and this button for practice, but now we don't need it anymore. So we can actually remove this code and remove this practice button. Now let's scroll back up. And we're going to use this code to add a new chat message. However, we have a problem here. We don't actually have access to set chat messages inside this component because this is inside a different component. To solve this problem, we're going to learn a technique called lifting the state up. First, we need to visualize the components in our app. So we have an app component, which represents the entire application. And inside, we have a chat input component and a chat messages component. Inside the chat messages component, we have some chat message components. This is called the component tree because it looks like the branch of a tree. And this helps us visualize the structure of the components in our app. Currently, chat messages and set chat messages are located inside the chat messages component. But we want to use it in the chat input component as well. To solve this problem, we're going to move this state up into the app component. And then app can share chat messages and set chat messages between these two components. This technique is called lifting the state up. By moving the state up to an outer component, it lets us share state between multiple components. So let's give this a try. First, we're going to move the chat messages state up into app. So in our code, we're going to scroll down to the chat messages state, which is right here, and we're going to move it into the app component. So we'll select all this code and then cut and remove these lines. And then inside the app component, we'll create some new lines and paste. So now we lifted the state up into the app component. Next, we're going to share the state between the two components using props. So first, the chat input component needs set chat messages and chat messages. So down here, Let's create two props for this component. We'll create a prop called chat messages equals curly brackets, and we're going to save the value of chat messages from the state. So we'll save chat messages, and we'll give it another prop called set chat messages equals curly brackets, and we'll give it the set chat messages function from the state. So set chat messages. By the way, notice that chat messages is an array. So using curly brackets, we can save an array into this prop. So we can save any type of value inside a prop. And then inside chat input, we can access these two props by scrolling up. And in the chat input component, at the top, we'll type curly brackets, and we'll get the chat messages prop, comma, and we'll also get the set chat messages prop. And now this code has access to set chat messages and chat messages. Next, let's scroll back down to the chat messages component. So here, we just need the chat messages array to generate the HTML. So let's provide chat messages using a prop. At the bottom, at the chat messages component, we're going to add a prop. Chat messages equals curly brackets, and we'll give it the chat messages array. So here, chat messages. Now, I want to talk about the naming convention used here. You'll notice that the component, the prop, and the data all use the same name, instead of using names like this. This is the naming convention used in the React documentation. The documentation tries to use the same name for many things, like the component, the props, and the data. This keeps things simple and consistent. We don't have to come up with different names every time, and when we look at other people's React code, the names will be the same. So don't worry, it might be a bit confusing at first because many things use the same name. The more you work with React, the more you'll get used to this naming convention. And we'll get lots of practice in this course. Now, to access this prop, we're going to scroll up. And up here, we'll type curly bracket, and we'll get the chat messages prop. And now this code has access to everything that it needs. Let's save our code and then check our website. And you'll notice that everything still works. We just lifted the state up into the app component and shared it between chat input and chat messages. Let's go back to our code. And we're going to scroll up to the chat input component. So now that chat input has access to set chat messages, let's use it to create a new chat message. So when we click send, we're going to run set chat messages, and we're going to give it a copy of the chat messages array with a new message at the end. In this new message, instead of test every time, we're going to use the text inside the text box, which is saved in input text. So we'll remove this and replace it with input text. The sender will be the user because we sent this message, and we'll give the message a unique ID. And that's it. This will update the chat messages array with this new message. And because we use the updater function, React will also update the HTML. So let's save, and we'll go to our project. Inside this text box, let's type hello and press send. It will take the text in the text box, create a new chat message, and it will update the HTML. Next, there is one improvement that we can make at this point. If we scroll up, after we press send, we should also remove the text in the text box, so we don't have to manually remove it if we want to send another message. To do that, we're going to learn a feature called controlled inputs. Let's go back to our code. And after adding a new message, we're going to remove the text in the text box. So after this, let's use the updater function, set input text brackets. We'll change the input text to the empty string. So this will update the input text up here to be empty. However, it will not update the HTML yet. To update the HTML, we need to use this input text inside this HTML. To do that, we're going to give the input element a prop called value equals curly brackets. So value lets us change the value of this input or the text inside this input. So we're going to set the value to whatever input text is. So now if we set the input text to be empty, this will set the value to be empty as well, and it will make the text box empty. Let's save. We'll go back to our website. Inside the text box, we're going to type hello and press send. And you'll notice that it makes the text box empty after we send. So let's go back to our code. And this is called a controlled input. Using the value prop, we can control the text inside this text box using our code. The last feature we're going to work on in this lesson is if we scroll up, after we send a message, we're going to get a response from the chatbot. To get a response, we're going to use another external library. So we'll scroll up to the script elements up here, and to add another external library, we're going to add another script element. And we're going to give this element the source attribute equals double quotes. And we're going to give it the URL of the external library. Now this is another external library that I wrote. So let's just copy one of these URLs up here with super simple dev, and we'll copy. And inside here, we're going to paste. And then at the end, instead of react.js, we're going to load chatbot.js and save. So now let's take a look at the code in this URL. On Windows, you can press Control and click this link. And on Mac, you can press Command and click this link. If it doesn't open, you can also type the URL in the browser. So again, an external library is just normal JavaScript code that someone else wrote. In this case, it's some code that I wrote. And this JavaScript code creates a simple chatbot. This is an object, and it has a method called getResponse. We just have to give it our message, and it will return a response. So now let's use this external library. We'll go back to VS Code, and we'll scroll down to chat input. And now after we send a message, below this, let's use the chatbot external library to get a response. So the external library creates a variable called C chatbot. This is an object, and it has a method called .getResponse and brackets. Between the brackets, we're just going to put the message that we sent, which is input text. So in here, we'll type input text. And getResponse will return a response. So let's save it in a variable using const, and we'll name it response equals this result. And next, let's just console.log the response to see what it looks like. Console.log the response and save. And now let's go to our website, and we're going to close the external library for now. And then we're going to click this text box, and we'll type the message hello and press send. And now inside our console, it will display the response from the chatbot. And the chatbot responded with, hello, how can I help you? So using the chatbot external library, we're able to get a response from the chatbot. The last step is we're going to display this chatbot response on the website. Let's go back to VS Code. And to display the response on the website, we can just add another chat message using setChatMessages. Because this is an updater function from the state, React will automatically update the website as well. So down here, we'll remove console.log, and let's just copy paste this code up here to create a new message. So we'll copy, and then down here, we'll paste. And here, the message should be the response from the chatbot. So we'll replace this with response. And the sender is going to be the robot this time. And we'll give it a unique ID. So now let's save this code and try it out. We'll open the website, and then in the text box, we'll type hello and press send. And if we look at the website, it sort of worked. It displayed the response from the chatbot on the website. However, it also removed our hello message. So why did this happen? Let's go back to VS Code. And if we look at this code, here we updated chat messages by making a copy and adding a new message at the end. However, in React, state does not update immediately. The state is updated after all of the code is finished. So here, all of the code is not finished yet. So chat messages is not updated to this new array immediately. So when we get to this point in the code, this chat messages is still the old array without the new message that we added up here. And then we take the old array and we add the chatbot's response, and we essentially lost our message. So one way to fix this issue is to save this updated chat messages in a variable. So above this, we're going to create a new variable using const, and let's name it new chat messages equals, and we're going to save this value. So we'll select this code and then cut, and up here, we're going to paste. And we'll set the chat messages to this variable, new chat messages. So this does the same thing as before, except we saved the new chat messages in this variable. And then down here, instead of making a copy of chat messages, we're going to make a copy of new chat messages, which contains our new message that we just added. So now it will have our message, and we're going to add the chatbot's response. So now let's save this code and go to our website. In the text box, we're going to type hello and press send. And it displays our message, hello, and the chatbot's response, hello, how can I help you? Let's try another example. In the text box, we can type, can you flip a coin? And press send. It will add and display our message, and it will add and display the chatbot's response, which is sure you got heads or tails, and everything is working correctly. So as you can see, state is another way that React helps us create websites easier. All we have to do is update the state, and React will automatically update the website. We don't have to update the website manually ourselves. And that's it. Using state, we created the functionality that we need for this project. In the next lesson, we'll style this with CSS to make it look like the final chatbot project. And that's the end of this lesson. In this lesson, we saved the data for our website using arrays and objects. We generated the HTML using .map and the key prop. We made the website interactive using onClick and onChange. We learned state, which is data that changes over time and is connected to the HTML. We used the updater function to update the state and update the HTML at the same time. We learned the array destructuring shortcut. We learned a technique called lifting the state up, which lets us share state between components. We made the chat input component interactive and created new chat messages. And we got responses from the chatbot. Here are some exercises to help you practice what we learned in this lesson. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to use CSS with React, and we'll finish the chatbot project. Let's go back to our code, and we'll start by reviewing CSS. CSS is another language, and it lets us change the appearance of the website. To use CSS with React, we just use CSS normally. So one way to use CSS is to create a style element. So we'll scroll to the top of our code, to the head element, and then inside here, we'll create a style element. So the style element doesn't appear on the website. That's why we put it in the head section. And the special thing about the style element is we can write CSS code inside. In here, we'll type the CSS code button and curly brackets. And inside, we'll type background dash color colon green and semicolon. So this is some CSS code. As a review, this code at the front is called the CSS selector. This tells the computer which elements we want to change the appearance. And inside, we have CSS styles. This tells the computer how to change the appearance of these elements. The left side is called the CSS property. This is what we're changing. And the right side is called the CSS value. This is what we're changing the property to. So this code changes all buttons on the website and changes the background color to green. If we save and then check our website, you can see that it changed the background color of the button to green. Let's go back to our code. And one problem here is button will style all buttons on the website. But usually, we want to just style a specific button. For example, let's scroll down to the chat input component, and we're going to scroll down to this send button here. So let's say we just want to style this send button. As a review, to style a specific element, we can add an HTML attribute called class. In React, to set the class attribute, we're going to give this element a prop called class N name equals double quotes. And we'll give it the class send-button. In React, we use class name to set the class. That's because React is actually just JavaScript code, and JavaScript already has a feature called class. So class is a reserved word, and we can't use it. That's why React uses class name to set the class. Now that this button has the class send-button, we can style this specific element. We'll go to our CSS, and in here, we're going to remove button, and we're going to type dot, and then the class send-button. As a review, if we start the CSS selector with a dot, it will only style elements with this class. So this will only style elements with the class send-button. If we save and check our website, it styles our send button because we gave it the send-button class. If we open the console and go to the Elements tab, and then we look at our HTML here, and we find the send button, you'll notice that it has the class attribute. So class name in React is converted to class in HTML. Now that we reviewed CSS, we're going to style this button to look like the final design. So first, we're going to put the final design and our website side by side, so it's easier to compare. So I'll take the final design here, and I'll put it on the bottom left, and I'll take our website and put it in the top left. And I'm going to resize our code editor so we can see everything side by side. And I'll hide the sidebar. Next, to style our send button to look like the final project, we just have to style it one by one with CSS. So we already made the background color green. Next, let's make the text color white. To do that, we'll type the CSS property color, and set it to white, and save. And that will make the text color white. Next, let's make our button bigger. To do that, we'll add space on the inside of the button. As a review, space on the inside of an element is called padding. So in our CSS, we're going to add padding, and we'll give the padding two values, 12px and 20px. So the px here stands for pixels. A pixel is a unit of measurement in computers. For example, my computer screen is about 3,800 pixels wide. So 12 pixels and 20 pixels looks like this. The first value is the vertical space inside this button. And the second value is the horizontal space inside this button. So we're going to add space all around the inside of this button. So let's save. And it adds space on the inside. And I think that looks close enough. Next, let's add some space on the outside of this button on the left. As a review, space on the outside of an element is called margin. So in our CSS, we'll add margin dash, and we'll add it on the left, and let's add 10 pixels of margin, and save, and that looks close enough. Next, our button has a border around the button, but in the final design, there is no border. To remove the borders, we'll type the property border, and set it to none, and save. and that will remove the borders. Next, the corners of the button in the final design are round. To make our corners round, we're going to use the CSS property border-radius, colon, and then how round we want the corners to be. Let's try 10 pixels and save. And I think that looks close enough. Next, the text in the button is a little bigger in the final design. To change the size of the text, we'll use the CSS property font-size, colon, and let's try 15 pixels and save. And that looks pretty good. Next, if we put our mouse over our button, we no longer have the hand pointer icon that we see here. To use this hand pointer icon, we're going to set the property cursor, colon, pointer, and save. And now if we put our mouse over the button, we have the hand pointer icon again. Finally, the background color of our button is a little different from the final design. So to get this exact green color, we can go to the final project, and then we're going to right-click this button, and then click Inspect. And we can click these three dots here, and click this icon to open the console in a different window. And we're going to go to the Elements tab, and we'll find the Send button in the HTML, and we're going to look at these styles. So you can see that this button here has a background color of this RGB value. So we're going to select this RGB value, and we're going to copy it. And in our code, instead of the color green, we're going to paste this RGB color. As a review, RGB stands for red, green, blue, and it's a way to measure color in computers. Computers can create any color using a combination of red, green, and blue. The first value here is how much red we want in the color. The second value is how much green we want in the color. And the third value is how much blue we want. And each value goes from 0 to 255. So this color combines a little bit of red, a lot of green, and a bit of blue to get this exact green color. So let's save our code. And now our button matches the final project. And that's how we style the Send button. We just style it one by one using CSS until it looks like the final design. So this is just a review of CSS. If you want to learn CSS in more detail, you can check out my HTML and CSS full course in the video description. Next, we're going to style this text box to look like the final design. Again, we're just going to style it one by one with CSS. First, we need to add a class to this element so we can select it in our CSS. We'll go to our code, and we're going to scroll down to this text box, which is inside the chat input component, and it's this input element here. So to add a class, we're going to use class name. So inside the input element, we'll add a class name equals double quotes, and let's give it the class chat-input. Now let's scroll back up to the CSS. And below these styles, we're going to type dot to select a class. And we're going to select the class we just added, which is chat-input and curly brackets. And now we're ready to style the text box. The first thing we'll change is there's a lot of space on the inside of this text box in the final design. So again, space on the inside of an element is called padding. In our CSS, we'll add padding, colon, and let's do 12 pixels for the vertical space and 15 pixels for the horizontal space. Now let's save. And that adds space on the inside of our text box. And I think that looks close enough. Next, we'll make the corners round. To do that, we'll use border dash radius colon, and let's try 10 pixels and save. And that looks pretty good. Next, our border is too thick compared to the final design. To change the thickness of the border, we'll use border dash width colon, and let's change it to 1 pixel and save. So that looks pretty good. Finally, the text is bigger in the final design. To change the size of the text, we can use font dash size colon, and let's use 15 pixels again. So 15 px and save. And I think that looks good enough for now. So we styled the text box one by one to look like the final design. Next, in the final design, the text box is wider. And this text box is also flexible. That means if we resize the browser, the text box will also resize. To make our text box flexible, we're going to review a feature of CSS called Flexbox. Flexbox lets us create a flexible layout. Layout means how the elements are positioned on the website. Here, we have a horizontal layout where the elements are beside each other. And also, this element is flexible. So Flexbox helps us create this flexible layout. To use Flexbox, we need to do 3 steps. The first step is to create a container around the elements that we want to position. So let's go back to our code, and we're going to scroll down to the chat input component, and we'll scroll down to the HTML. So here, we want to position the text box and the button. So we need to create a container around these 2 elements. Right now, we have a fragment around these 2 elements. However, we cannot style a fragment with CSS, since fragments don't actually appear on the website. Instead, we're going to switch this container to a div element because we can style a div element. So inside here, we'll type div, and at the end, we'll do /div to convert this container to a div element. And now we have a container around the elements. The second step is to add the property displayFlex to the container. First, let's add a class name to this container so we can select it in our CSS. In here, we'll type class name equals double quotes, and we'll give it the class chat-input-container. And then we'll scroll up to our CSS. And at the end, we'll type dot to select a class, and we'll select the class chat-input-container and curly brackets. And finally, we'll add the property display::flex, and that will turn this container into a flexbox. The third step is to use Flexbox features. Flexbox has many features we can use to control the layout or to control how these elements are positioned. One feature is called Flex Grow. Flex Grow makes an element grow and take up the remaining space. So here, we want this text box to grow and take up this remaining space. So we'll go to the styles for the chat input or the text box, and we'll add the property flex-grow:1 and save. And now the text box will grow and take up the remaining space. If we resize the browser, the text box will also resize to take up the remaining space. So now we created the layout for the chat input that we see in the final design. Next, we'll create the layout for the overall app. Notice in the final project, if we resize the browser and make it wider, the app is limited to a certain width, so it's not going to get wider. To create this in our project, we'll set a maximum width for our app. So let's go to our code, and we're going to scroll down to the app component, which is down here, and we'll go down to the HTML. And currently, the app is contained in a fragment. And remember, we cannot style a fragment, since fragments don't actually appear on the website. So again, we're going to switch this to a div element so we can style it. So in here, we'll type div, and at the bottom, we'll type /div. And now we can style this. First, we'll add a class to this div using class name equals double quotes, and let's give it the class app-container. And we'll scroll up to our CSS. And at the bottom here, we'll type dot to select a class, and we'll select the class app-container and curly brackets. And to set a maximum width of our app, we can just use the property max-width, and let's try 600 pixels, and save. So now if we resize our browser, the app will be limited to 600 pixels, just like the final design. Next, in the final design, notice that the app is centered on the website. Now, there are several ways to center an element in CSS. One way is to use margin. So we'll go back to our code, and in the app container, we're going to add the property margin-left, and we'll set it to auto. And we'll also set the margin-right, auto. So this will automatically add a space on the left and right of this element until it is centered. So if we save our code and check our website, you'll notice that the entire app is now centered on the website. And now we created the layout for the overall app. Next, we're going to create the layout for the chat messages. If you don't have any chat messages in your final project, you can add some by typing in here and then pressing send. So notice that the chat messages from the user are on the right, while the chat messages from the robot are on the left. So we're going to create this layout. First, we need to give class names to these chat messages so we can style them. So let's resize our browser for now, and we'll go to our code, and we're going to scroll down to the chat message component, and we'll scroll down to the HTML. And we'll give each chat message a class name equals, and we're going to do something different this time. We'll type curly brackets. So here, we want to give a different class name depending on if the sender is the user or the sender is the robot. This will let us position the chat messages differently on the right or on the left. To give this a different class name depending on the sender, we're going to use a feature of JavaScript called the ternary operator. As a review, the ternary operator looks like this, and it works like an if-else statement. If value 1 is true, then the result is value 2. Else, the result is value 3. The ternary operator lets us insert an if-else statement directly in the JSX. So using a ternary operator, we can give a different class name depending on the sender. Inside here, we're going to type the if condition. So we'll check if the sender is equal to the string user. And then we'll type question mark. If the sender is the user, we'll set the class name to the string chat-message-user. And then we'll type a colon. So this means else. So if the sender is not the user, we're going to give the class name the string chat-message-robot. So again, the way this code works is if the sender is equal to user, we'll set the class name to chat-message-user. Else, we'll set the class name to chat-message-robot. As you can see, the ternary operator lets us insert an if-else statement directly in the JSX. And notice that we used curly brackets here because we want to save the result of this code into class name instead of just a string. Before we continue, we can add some new lines to this code to make it easier to read. So at the beginning, we can add a new line, and then we'll add a new line before the question mark and press tab, and we'll add a new line before the colon, and we'll add a new line at the back, and remove some spaces so that this is vertically aligned. So this makes the code a bit easier to read. We have the if condition, and then the first value, and then else the second value. Now let's save, and we'll go to our website, and let's check the HTML. So in our console, we can click these three dots here, and then click this icon to open the console in another window. And we'll go to the Elements tab, and we'll click this pointer on the top left, and we'll select one of these chat messages and click it. And if we scroll down here, you can see that each chat message now has a class. And messages from the user have the class chatMessageUser, and messages from the robot have the class chatMessageRobot. So now that we added a class to each of these chat messages, let's style these chat messages. We'll go to our code, and we'll scroll up to our CSS. And at the end, let's type a dot. And first, let's select the class chat-message-user and curly brackets. And now for chat-message-user, we want to position these elements, the text and the profile image, on the right. To create this flexible layout, we can use Flexbox again. Remember, there are 3 steps to use Flexbox. First, we already have a container around the elements. It has a class chatMessageUser or chatMessageRobot. Next, we need to add displayFlex to this container. So for chatMessageUser, we'll add display::flex. And now we can use Flexbox features. Another feature of Flexbox is we're going to type justify-content: Justify content controls how the elements are displayed horizontally. If we want these elements to be displayed on the right, we're going to give this a value end. So it will display these elements at the end of this row or on the right. So now let's save our code. And now the chat messages from the user are on the right. And we created the layout for the chat messages. Next, we're going to style the text in the chat messages. First, we need to add a class name to this text so we can style it. Let's go to our code, and we're going to scroll down to the chat message component, and we're going to scroll to the text, which is here. So currently, this text is not inside an element. So first, we're going to put this text inside an element so that we can style just the text. Above this, we'll put this in a div by typing less than div greater than, and below it, less than slash div greater than. And we'll add an indent at the front to show that this text is inside this div. And now let's add a class to this div so we can style just the text. So we'll give this a class name equals double quotes, and let's give it the class chat-message-text. So now let's style this with CSS. We'll scroll up to our CSS, and at the end, we'll type a dot, and we'll style the class chat-message-text and curly brackets. So the first thing we'll style is we're going to change the background color to this gray color. To get this exact color, we're going to right-click on this text and then click Inspect. And we'll find this text in the Elements tab, and we're going to go into the Styles, and we'll get the background color. So we'll copy this RGB color, and we'll go into our code, and we'll set the background-color, and we'll paste the RGB color, and save. And now we'll have the exact color in our final design. However, after we saved, it kind of messed up our layout. So the chat message user looks okay, but the text for chat message robot is now appearing below the profile image, and it's taking up the entire line. So what happened? Remember that we just surrounded this text in a div element. Normally, a div element takes up an entire line by itself because a div is a block element. However, remember that we also made chat message user a flexbox. When a block element is inside a flexbox, it no longer takes up the entire line. It only takes up as much space as it needs to. So that's why this div only takes up as much space as it needs, because it's inside a flexbox. One way to fix this layout problem is we can make chat message robot a flexbox as well. We'll go back to our code, and below chat message user, let's type dot, and we'll style the chat-message-robot and curly brackets. And we'll also give it display::flex. So it will match the layout for the chat message user. Let's save. And now, because this div is inside a flexbox, it only takes up as much space as it needs. So now the background color and the layout looks good. Next, the style of text or the font is different in the final design. To change the font, we'll go to our code and we'll add the property font-family, : and in the final project, I use the font Arial. Let's save. And now our font matches the final design. Now, usually, we don't set the font for just one element. We set the font for the entire website because we want the entire website to use the same font or the same style of text. To set the font for the entire website, we can style the body element. So we'll scroll to the top of our CSS, and here we'll style the body element, curly brackets, and we'll set the font-family : to Arial. So this sets the font for all elements inside the body, which is basically the entire website. So now we can scroll back down and we can remove this style because we're going to set the font for the entire website instead. Let's save. And now we set the font for the entire website to Arial. Next, let's add space on the inside of this text, which is padding. So here, we'll add padding, colon, and let's try 15 pixels of vertical space and 20 pixels of horizontal space, and save. And that looks pretty good. Next, we'll make the corners round. To do that, we'll use border dash radius colon and 10 pixels, and save. And that looks pretty good. Next, let's add space on the outside of the text on the right. So we'll add margin dash right colon, and let's try 10 pixels, and save. And that looks close enough. And here, if we scroll down to a chat message from the robot, we'll add some space on the left of the text. So in our code, we'll add margin dash left, and let's try 10 pixels, and save. And that looks pretty good. Finally, let's add some space on the bottom of the text so we can separate them. Here, we'll add margin dash bottom colon, and let's try 20 pixels, and save. And I think that looks close enough. However, we now have a problem here, which is the profile image seems to be stretching. This happens because this container is a flexbox, and by default, elements inside a flexbox will stretch vertically. So if this text gets longer because we added some margin, this image will stretch. To fix this, Flexbox has another feature called Align Items. So in our CSS, in chat message user, we'll add the property align dash items colon, and align items controls how the elements are displayed vertically. By default, align items is stretch. That's why the elements stretch vertically. Instead, we're going to change align items to start. This will display the elements at the start or at the top vertically, and it will no longer stretch. Same thing for the chat message robot. We're going to give it align dash items colon start, and save. And now the elements in the flexbox will appear at the start or at the top vertically. The last thing we'll style for the text is if we go to our final project, and inside the text box, we type test and press send. You'll notice that the response from the chatbot has a maximum width. So in our project, we're also going to add a maximum width to our text. So in our code, we'll go to the chat message text, and let's add a max dash width colon, and let's try 300 pixels, and save. And now if we go to our text box and type test and press send and scroll down, the text has a maximum width and it matches the final design. Now we finish styling the text in the chat messages. Next, we'll style the profile images. So in our code, let's scroll down to the profile image, which is inside the chat message component. And it's these two image elements here. Currently, we're using an attribute to set the width of this image. However, a best practice is to use CSS for styling instead of attributes. So let's remove this attribute, and we'll remove it down here as well. And we'll add a class to these profile images so that we can style them with CSS. So here, we'll add class name equals double quotes, and we'll give it the class chat-message-profile. And we'll also add this class to the profile image for the user. We'll give it the class name equals double quotes chat-message-profile. So now we can style this with our CSS. We'll scroll up to our CSS, and at the end, we'll type a dot, and we'll style the class chat-message-profile and curly brackets. So previously, we set the width to 50 pixels. So let's do that again using CSS this time. We'll set the width to 50 pixels and save. Now, if we look at the final design, it looks like the profile images here are a little bit smaller than our profile images. So let's make this width smaller. Let's try 45 pixels instead and save. And I think that looks close enough. And now our profile images are the same size as the final design. The last thing we're going to change in this design is we're going to move the text box to the bottom so that it matches the design of other popular chatbots. In the final project, we're going to make this a little taller now. We can move this text box to the bottom of the page by clicking this link. And now let's create this design in our project. First, I'll open our project and then move it back to the same window so that we can see this side by side a little easier. And to put the text box at the bottom of the page, the first step is to move the text box below the chat messages. We'll go to our code and we're going to scroll down to the app component, which is here. And we'll scroll to the HTML, and we're just going to move this chat input below the chat messages. So we'll select this component, and we'll cut, and below chat messages, we'll paste, and save. And now the chat input will be below the chat messages, and that looks pretty good. Next, we also want to put this chat input at the bottom of the browser here. So there are several ways to do this in CSS. One way is to use Flexbox again. Now, before we use Flexbox, we're going to make the app container stretch to the bottom of the browser. So right now, if we click inside here and we right-click and inspect, and we go to the Elements tab, and we scroll up and look at the app container, notice that the app container stops at the chat input section. And that's because this is all the content that we have. So the app container only has the height that it needs. However, we want to stretch the app container to the bottom of the browser so that we can put the chat input at the bottom. To do that, we're going to set the height of the app container. So we'll go back to our code, and we'll scroll up to our CSS, and we're going to find the styles for the app container, which is right here. And at the end, we're going to set the height, and now we want the height of the app container to stretch to be the same as the height of the browser here. To do that, we're going to give this a special value, 100 VH. So VH stands for viewport height. This gives us the height of the browser, or the part of the page that is visible. 100 VH means 100% of the height of the browser. So this means the app container will be 100% of this height. So now let's save, and we'll go to our website and we'll open the console again. by right-clicking and inspect, and go to the Elements tab, and we'll scroll up to the app container again. And now you'll notice the app container stretches to the bottom of the browser. However, the app container is actually a little too tall, so it actually stretches below the bottom of the page. And now we can scroll a bit here. The reason it's a little bit too tall is because by default, the body element here has a default margin of 8 pixels on all sides. So the app container is the same height as the browser, but then we add another 8 pixels on the top and bottom. To fix this issue, we can just remove the default margin from the body. So we'll go back to our code and scroll up to the styles for the body. And at the end, let's remove the margin at the top and bottom by typing margin-top : and we'll set it to 0 pixels. And we'll also set the margin-bottom : to 0 pixels and save. So now, after we remove the default margin from the top and the bottom, the app container is now exactly the same height as the browser. Now that the app container stretches to the bottom of the browser, we can use a flexbox to make the chat messages grow and push the chat input to the bottom. Again, there are 3 steps to use a flexbox. So here, we want to position the chat messages and the chat input. So we need a container around these elements. And we already have a container for this, which is the app container. The second step is to add display flex to the container. So we'll go back to our code, and we're going to scroll to the app container styles, which is right here. And below this, we'll add display : flex. Let's save our code. And unfortunately, it totally messed up our design. So what happened? By default, Flexbox positions our elements horizontally. So it takes all the elements inside the container and then squeezes them into a row like we see here. However, this time we want to position the elements vertically, not horizontally. To position the elements vertically, we're going to use a Flexbox feature called Flex Direction. So in here, we'll type flex-direction : flex direction determines which direction the elements are positioned. So flex direction is row by default. That means it positions the elements horizontally, like we see here. Now, we're going to change flex direction to column. So this positions the elements vertically in a column. If we save our code and check the website, the elements in the Flexbox are now positioned vertically, from top to bottom. Next, we're going to use Flex Grow again. As a review, Flex Grow makes an element grow and take up the remaining space. Here, we want to make the chat messages section grow and take up all the remaining vertical space. And this will push the chat input down to the bottom. To use Flex Grow, we're going to add a class to the chat messages section. We'll go to our code and we'll scroll down to the chat messages component, which is right here. And currently, this component uses a fragment. And remember, we cannot style a fragment since fragments don't appear on the website. So again, we're going to switch this to a div element, and at the end, /div, so that we can style it. And now we'll give this div a class using class name equals double quotes, and we'll give it the class chat-messages-div. container. And now let's style this class. We'll scroll up in our CSS, and at the end here, we'll type dot, and we'll style the class chat-messages-container and curly brackets. And we'll use the Flexbox feature flex-grow : 1. So now let's save. And this makes the chat message container grow and take up the remaining vertical space. And this will push the chat input to the bottom of the browser. So that's how we use a Flexbox to position the chat input at the bottom. Finally, if we look at the final design, we have some space at the top of the app and at the bottom of the app. So let's add that space at the top and bottom to our website. We'll go to our CSS, and currently the app container has a special height of 100 VH. So let's avoid changing this. Instead, let's add space above the chat messages container. So we'll scroll down to the chat messages container, and we'll add some space at the top using margin-top : 20 pixels. And we'll also add some space below the chat input container. So we'll scroll up to the chat input container, which is right here, and we'll add space at the bottom using margin-bottom : and let's try 60 pixels, and save. And now that looks pretty good. And now if we look at our website and compare it to the final design, you can see that it looks the same as the final design. So we finished styling our project to look like the final design using CSS. Next, we're going to make the chat messages scrollable. In the final project, if we have more chat messages than we can see in the browser, we can actually scroll to see all of the chat messages. Now you may need to add more chat messages down here in order to see this feature. So we're going to create this feature in our project. If we go to our project and we add some more messages like test and press send, notice if we have too many messages, it starts to push the chat input down. To make our chat messages scrollable, we're going to go to the CSS and we're going to find the chat messages container, which is right here. And at the end, we'll add a property overflow : scroll. So now if the chat messages overflow or there's too many to be displayed, it will start to scroll instead of pushing things down. Let's save our code and then add another message, test, and press send. And you may need to add a few more messages to see this feature. Now, if we have too many messages, we're able to scroll up and down to see all the messages. Now, before we continue, on Windows, we have a small problem, which is we start to see these thick scroll bars on the sides, which doesn't look very good. To hide these scroll bars, we can go back to our CSS, and at the end, we can use the property scroll bar dash width : none. So now let's save. And if we add a message test and press send, and you might need to add more messages for your project. Now, if we have more messages than we can see, we can scroll and we hide the scroll bars. So that's how we make the chat messages scrollable. The last feature we're going to add to our project is auto scrolling. For example, if we go down here and add the message test and press send, notice we have to manually scroll down to the bottom ourselves. But if we go to the final project and at the bottom add a message test and press send, notice that it automatically scrolls to the bottom of the chat messages. So we're going to add this auto scrolling feature. Let's go back to our website. And to create auto scrolling, we're going to learn one of the most important features of React called hooks. Hooks let us insert React features into our component. And we've actually used hooks before. React.useState is a hook. It inserts a React feature called state into our component. And state automatically updates the HTML when the data changes. Now, React has other hooks that we can use, and every hook starts with the word use. Another hook is called useEffect. UseEffect lets us run some code after the component is created or updated. So in our project, after we add a chat message, we want to run some code to scroll to the bottom. So this is a perfect situation for useEffect. Inside our code, we're going to scroll down to the chat messages component, which is here. And at the top of the component, we're going to type the code capital R React dot use capital E effect and brackets. By the way, in React, we should put our hooks at the top of the component, and they should not be inside anything. So don't put a hook inside an if statement or inside a function. Next, we'll give useEffect a function. So inside these brackets, we'll type a function using brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. As a reminder, when we give a function to another function, we usually use an arrow function because it's a bit cleaner. So React will run this function after the component is created and every time the component is updated. Inside here, let's try console.log the string updated and save. And now if we go to our project and we look at the console, so we'll right click, inspect, and we go to the console, you'll see that after the component is created, it runs the function and displays updated. And then we're going to go to our website and we're going to add a new message like hello and press send. So now after the component is updated, React runs the function again. So as you can see, useEffect lets us run some code after the component is created or updated. So now let's go back into our code and we'll give useEffect a second parameter. So at the end, we'll type a comma and we'll give a second parameter, which is an array. So this array controls when useEffect runs. If we give it an empty array, useEffect will only run once after the component is created. Now, inside this array, we can also put some data, such as our chat messages. So we'll type chat messages. And now React will also run this function every time our data changes or every time our chat messages changes. If we save and we look at the console, useEffect runs after the component is created. And now if we add a message like hello and press send, useEffect also runs after chat messages changes. So now let's go back to our code. And this is called a dependency array. It lets us control when useEffect runs. A best practice is to give useEffect a dependency array to avoid running this function too often. So now we learned hooks and the useEffect hook. And now we can run some code after the chat messages changes. The last step is after the chat messages changes, we want to automatically scroll to the bottom. To scroll to the bottom, first we need to get the HTML element that we want to scroll into our JavaScript. Let's go back to our code, and inside this function, instead of console.log, we need to get this div, chat messages container, into our JavaScript. Now, in normal JavaScript, we might use the DOM to get this element. But remember, in React, we should not use the DOM manually. Instead, we should use React features to get this element. To get this element using React, we're going to use another hook called useRef. So at the top of this component, we're going to type the code capital R React dot use capital R ref and brackets. useRef lets us automatically save an HTML element from the component. So this code creates a ref. A ref is a container with special React features. One special feature is we can give this ref or this container to React, and React can automatically save an HTML element inside this ref or inside this container. So between these brackets, we're first going to put the value null. So this is the initial value that is saved inside this ref or inside this container. So the ref is going to start out as empty. So that's why we use null. Now let's save an HTML element inside this ref. To do that, first we're going to save this ref in a variable. So at the front, we'll create a variable using const, and we'll name it chat messages ref equals this result. And then we're going to go to the HTML element we want to save, which is this div, the chat messages container. And we're going to give this element a special prop called ref equals curly brackets. And between the curly brackets, we're going to give it the ref that we created above, which is chat messages ref. So now React will take this HTML element and save it inside this ref or inside this container. To access the HTML element saved inside a ref, we're going to go to use effect, and we're going to type the name of the ref, which is chat messages ref, and then .current. Now, the reason we put this code in use effect is because remember, use effect runs after the component is created. So we need to wait for the component to be created first, and then we can access this HTML element. So now let's console.log this value to see what's inside this ref. So at the front, we'll console.log, open bracket, and close bracket, and save. And we'll open the console for our website. And you'll see that React saved the chat messages container inside our ref. Now that we have the HTML element we need to scroll, let's learn how to scroll it to the bottom. Let's go back to our code. And first, we're going to save this HTML element in a variable. So we'll remove this. And at the front, we'll create a variable const. And let's name it container lm equals this result. So ending the variable name with lm tells us that this variable contains an HTML element. And I'll resize my code editor so we can see more of the code. Next, we'll create a new line. And it's a good idea to check if this element actually exists before we scroll it. So we'll check if brackets container lm. Finally, we'll type curly brackets And to scroll this element to the bottom, we can use this code. Container lm dot scroll top, and we'll make it equal container lm dot scroll height. So scroll top means how far from the top should we scroll. And scroll height gives us the total height of the element. So if we set the scroll top to the total height, it's going to scroll all the way down to the bottom, which is exactly what we need. So now let's save this code. And we'll go to our website and we'll add a message test and press send. It runs the useEffect function because chat messages changed, and it automatically scrolls to the bottom. Now, depending on the height of your browser, you might need to add a few more messages to see this effect. So we can also scroll up and then add another message like thank you and press send. It runs useEffect again, and it automatically scrolls to the bottom. And that's all the major features that we need for this project. I'll leave some extra features like removing these default messages and creating the loading spinner as exercises. And that's it. We created all the styling and features that we need, and we finished the chatbot project. In the next lesson, we'll learn how to do a proper React setup so we can organize our code into different files and folders instead of putting everything into one HTML file. And this will help us work on bigger React projects. And that's the end of this lesson. In this lesson, we learned how to use CSS with React. We styled the chatbot project. We reviewed Flexbox, which lets us create a flexible layout. We learned the ternary operator, which lets us insert an if-else statement directly in the JSX. We learned hooks, which lets us insert React features into our components. We learned the useEffect hook, which lets us run some code after the component is created or updated. We learned the useRef hook, which lets us automatically save an HTML element from the component. And we created the auto scroll feature for the chat messages. Here are some exercises to help you practice what we learned in this lesson. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to do a proper React setup. Right now, all of our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript code is combined into one HTML file, chatbot.html. Now, it's not good to combine all of our code in 3 different languages into one file, because if we work on bigger projects, this file might contain thousands of lines of code, and it will be almost impossible to manage all of that code if we put it all in one file. Instead, we're going to do a proper React setup that will let us split up this code into different files and folders. To create this React setup, we'll need to use the command line. So first, let's review the command line. We're going to go to VS Code, and I'm going to make this full screen. And to open the command line, we're going to click the menu at the top, and we're going to click the terminal menu, and we're going to open a new terminal. So here, we can give an instruction or a command to the computer. For example, we're going to type the command mkdir. Mkdir means make directory. A directory is another name for a folder. So make directory creates a new folder. Then we'll type a space and we'll give this folder a name like test. If we press enter, it creates a new folder named test. So if we